Well, that wasn't even close. Anyway, Pixar. What can honestly be said about Pixar Animation Studios that hasn't already been said? They've created so many iconic and classic films and wonderful characters, and they've pushed the technology of what was possible in terms of computer animation. So much so that they're probably the reason that traditional animation is basically dead over here in the States for now. But anyway, Pixar is also unique to me in particular because, well, I grew up with these films. I was right at the age where, as I was going through my childhood, Pixar was going through its golden era. And I was almost an adult by the time that golden era came to a close. I grew up with this company's films. These were, in essence, my films. The films that I watched over and over again and have very fond memories of. And even looking back on them as an adult, it's incredible how many of their films still hold up today. And even though they don't hit the mark as consistently as they did in its heyday, they can still pump out some truly breathtaking motion pictures. And that was because Pixar actually puts a lot of care into making not only passable kids films, but kids films that adults can enjoy just as much, and in some cases actually enjoy more than the kids. So okay, for this video, I will be focusing just on their feature-length films. Maybe I'll do their shorts later, but not today. This video is going to be long enough already. Their to-date 3 films released straight to Disney Plus count and will be included. And yes, I will be talking about Turning Red in this video. Yeah, that's going to be a fun review. And just like the last ranking video where I rewatched all the Disney live-action remakes, I will be doing so here with all the Pixar films, even if it might be pointless for me because in some cases I can practically recite these films line for line. But still, I think it's important that these films are as fresh in my mind as possible when I review them. And who knows, maybe some of these films that I give a second chance, I can see if my opinion on them has changed at all. Also, I'll try my best to keep the spoilers to a bare minimum, but I can't guarantee that a minor one might slip through. Also, as of the writing of this intro, the only Pixar films that I've yet to see is last year's Luca and, of course, this year's Turning Red. So now, undertaking this project actually gives me an excuse to sit down and watch them. As always, if you'd like to skip to a certain review, timestamps are included, so jump around however you want. Oh, and real quick before I get started. Since I know that a lot of people can get a little anal about the films that they like or don't like, just keep in mind that this is my opinion, my personal take on these films. And I only say this because I expect there's at least one movie out here that I'm probably going to get crucified for my take on. Alright, that's enough intro. Let's get into these films. The very first feature-length computer animated film ever made, we have Toy Story, which might actually be the film that I've seen the most out of any film ever made, because I used to watch this film as a kid all the time. And boy, talk about putting your best foot forward. Seriously, if there's a better debut film from a studio, animated or otherwise, please let me know, because I'm not aware of it. So anyway, the idea of toys coming alive whenever humans aren't around is not a new concept. It's been done for a long time, decades and decades. But I think what sets this apart is that this was the first time that this concept was done in our modern world. That's kind of what makes this film so interesting to me. Disney, when they were doing animated films, typically focused on stories of the past. Yeah, you know, like fairy tales and the like. Oh yeah, they made exceptions, but that's not what Disney was known for, especially back then. Disney's first film was a fairy tale after all, and fairy tales tend to be seen as timeless stories, so it does kind of make sense to go with a fairy tale if you want to invoke a timeless feel. But with Pixar's first film, they opted for a story that was unambiguously set in the 1990s American suburbs. And I think that using that setting, our modern world, and having something as fantastical as toys coming alive was a risk, but it paid off. It doesn't hurt that they avoided using modern slang, so the dialogue has actually aged really well. Anyway, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. I love this movie. I loved it as a kid, and I still love it now as an adult. And I'm not just saying that because of its status as one of the most important animated films of all time from a technological and historical perspective. I'm saying that because this is a legit amazing film with a great script, wonderful characters, a perfectly told story with real compelling drama, a great soundtrack by Randy Newman, and on top of it all, it's also really funny. But of course, this is all well known. This is one of the most heavily discussed animated films ever made. So what more could I add to the conversation? You know what? I don't think it gets talked about enough just how great Woody's character and arc is handled in this film. So let's talk about that for a second. You see, this film actually has a really difficult job to do. It has to make Woody into a likable character, or at the very least, a character that you want to see do the right thing, even as he gets more and more jealous and his actions get worse and worse before he comes around. This is a tightrope act with a thread so frayed that the slightest wrong move could have sunk the whole film. And if you ever watched the infamous Black Friday reel, you know precisely how bad this could have turned out if mishandled. Thankfully, they perfected that balance, and it's truly a sight to behold. And that's also a credit to the voice actor Tom Hanks, who, let's be honest, you could not have cast this role any better if you tried. Hanks just has the natural charm and comedic timing to make even some of Woody's jerkier moments a lot easier to swallow. And speaking of voice acting, Tim Allen is also perfect casting as Buzz Lightyear. Actually, to be honest, all the casting for the characters in this film is pitch perfect. Mostly because Allen plays the Saturday morning cartoon Space Ranger persona completely straight. Like Hanks, Allen was the perfect choice. Buzz is just such a wonderful character. The film takes advantage of his naivete, resulting in some amazingly hilarious one-liners. By the way, that's something that caught me off guard with this film rewatching it as an adult. It's just funny. Some of the lines still get laughs out of me even to this day, despite me having seen this film more times than I care to count. On top of that, there's also some clever and subtle puns. There's jokes in the background, there's also some very subtle nods to classic films, like the airplane reference at Pizza Planet. The one thing that especially took me aback upon rewatching this was just how edgy and surprisingly adult this film could get at times. And I'm not talking about the Jeffrey Katzenberg make everybody a jerk mentality, nor am I talking about the innuendo or subtle adult jokes. I'm talking about the themes that it touches on. And even how there is kind of this dark subtext if you're really paying attention. Really think about this for a second. How often do you see a kid's film where one of the main characters goes through an existential crisis and completely gives up on life because of it? Or a kid's film that showcases a brutal murder of a living object via an explosion? Or a film, any film, in which the triumphant ending is the main characters permanently traumatizing a young child? As a quick aside, am I the only one that thinks that at least one of Sid's parents is abusive? I mean, Sid very clearly acts like an abused kid that's acting out and is taking his aggression out on his toys that can't fight back and his little sister. There is a crap ton of locks on his bedroom door, and Scud also very clearly doesn't want to wake up one of the parents when they're passed out in their room, which to me indicates the parent has a history of being at least verbally abusive towards the dog. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too deep into this. But it would make Sid even more of a tragic villain than he already is, and make the ending of the toys scaring the crap out of him even crueler. Okay, sorry, I got sidetracked. Let's get back to the review. Honestly, it's just incredible to me how many hidden layers and jokes there are in this film. For instance, the aliens in the claw machine, whose only existence is life inside that machine, see the claw above them as a literal god who chooses who goes to the afterlife. That is so inspired and hilarious at the same time. And like I said before, there's themes that the film touches on. Sure, on a surface level, the film is about jealousy and the dangers associated with it. But the film also touches on some more adult themes, most predominantly purpose. Specifically, what you do when you feel that your entire purpose for existing is yanked away from you. And the clever thing is that it deals with it in two separate ways, both with Woody and Buzz. Woody saw his purpose as being Andy's favorite toy, and Buzz saw his purpose as being a space ranger. And both of their worldviews get shattered when they get forcibly confronted with the reality of the situation. Woody reacts by getting jealous and lashing out at those he cares about. Buzz reacts by sinking into a deep, dark depression. It's honestly just great. So yeah, this film is a good story, it's well paced with excellent, memorable, and well acted characters, and on top of it, it is funny to boot. So I guess the question must be asked, is this film perfect? Actually, to be honest, it's pretty darn close. So what are some of the issues with the film, minute as they might be? Well, first I want to address issues that other people with the film have brought up, and my thoughts on them. So, one issue that tends to get brought up is that Buzz, who in the first half believes that he's not a toy, would have no reason to freeze up like the other toys do. And, I don't know, I just kind of took it as toys freezing is just so encoded into their, for lack of a better term, DNA, so to speak, that they just do it unconsciously, kind of like how humans breathe or blink without even realizing that we do it. I don't know, that part just never bothered me. And yeah, the animation hasn't aged all that great, particularly when it comes to the human characters, which look kind of plastic, but honestly, the humans don't factor into the story that much, and the film does star toys who are, plastic. Honestly, it was kind of a stroke of genius on Pixar's part to have their first animated film be based on toys. It actually meant the animation aged way better than it had any right to. Like I said, I could criticize the moments of poorly aged animation, like how the storm outside Sid's window looks really flat, or the blatant continuity or animation errors, but to me, it would be like criticizing the effects of the original King Kong. Sure, I could do it, but when the filmmakers did the absolute best job that they could with the technology that they have at the time, I'd feel like kind of a jerk for criticizing that hard work only because we now have the technology that's advanced so much that the animation looks off. Also, there have been complaints that Sid's not really a villain because, well, he doesn't know that the toys are alive, so he's just playing with them in the only way that he knows how. But the film is told from the toys' perspective, so of course Sid's going to be presented in an antagonistic light. But okay, enough of what other people's complaints with the film are, and why they don't bother me. What is some of the stuff that actually did bother me? Honestly, I'd say there's really only two things that kind of bug me, and keep in mind, these are minor complaints. The first thing is the crane game, which, yeah, Sid not only manages to get an LGM on his first try, but then immediately manages to get Buzz and Woody on his very next try. Anyone who knows how crane games actually work, who has ever played a crane game themselves, knows that this might actually be the most unrealistic part of the entire film. The second is the scene where Buzz and Woody are going down the street on a rocket, and they are clearly seen passing a lot of cars to the left and right of them that were not there before. And at one point, as they're being lifted off the ground, you can see a car driving right behind them and watching the toys' every single move. Cars are not driverless entities, at least not yet. So a real-life human is watching this entire thing unfold in front of them. It's one of those moments that just kind of jerked me out of the universe for a second. But, like I said, that's me really digging and looking for things to complain about. Honestly, this film is just outstanding. It's a film that remembers that character comes first. It's a film that is brimming with life and personality, has lots of clever touches and jokes in the background, is surprisingly pretty edgy for a G-rated film distributed by Disney. It moves at a flawless pace. It's just a classic, pure and simple. Toy Story gets a 10 out of 10. This is an incredible debut for an incredible animation studio, and it actually held up surprisingly well, both for a computer animated film that's 27 years old and for a film that I loved as a child, and that I still love now as an adult. But you know what they say, sometimes if you peak too early, you may not be able to replicate that greatness. But Pixar might honestly be that one exception to the rule. Strap yourselves in because they're about to have what I feel is the most impressive run of consecutive animated films released by one animation studio that I have ever seen. A Bug's Life. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, this movie was everywhere, and I remember watching this on VHS a lot. But now that Pixar has been well established and they've made over 24 movies at this point, I think this one tends to get lost in Pixar's catalog. And if it is mentioned, it's only brought up in conjunction with the controversy surrounding the movie Ants, which I'm not going to get into here because I have a feeling this video is going to be long enough as is. But anyway, my point was that this film seems to have waned in popularity over the years, and I'm not going to lie, I think that's kind of a shame because I actually really enjoy this film and have a big soft spot for it. Now, does it have the emotional depth and complexities of some of Pixar's later films? No, not especially. But at its core, I find this to be a mostly charming and delightful kids film, and while I get where some of the criticisms come from, which I'll get into later, I can't help but find myself getting sucked into this film every time I watch it. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. For starters, I actually really like most of the characters. In a film where there are, let's be frank, a boatload of characters, it can be really difficult making all or even most of them stand out. But thanks to the great character designs, the fact that they got some really good voice actors to play them, gives these characters a lot of personality. And unlike Toy Story, where you can definitely tell they're struggling with some bits of the animation, here the animation has aged almost flawlessly, which again, I will credit to Pixar's decision to not include any humans in their film. The only area where you can tell they're really struggling is when they're animating water. I also think this film includes some really intimidating villains. Kevin Spacey gives a lot of menace and character to the main antagonist, Hopper. And honestly, he's not even that well written on paper, but the way he's animated, his mannerisms, the way he's presented, and the performance really help make him stand out. And while we're on the subject of the grasshoppers, I have to admit, when I was a kid, the grasshoppers' introduction was the scene that scared the crap out of me the most. I think it was the build-up surrounding them, how scared the ants were, and the quiet right before the grasshoppers, with barely any warning, just storm their way in. Even to this day, that scene of the ants waiting underground for the grasshoppers to leave still gives me chills. I also really like the circus bugs a lot. Again, they're well designed, they have some very distinct personalities, they have wonderful character actors voicing them, and some of them even get character arcs. Like I've said before, I can mostly forgive a film with kind of a weak story if the film has memorable characters. You can have a great film with great characters and a weak plot, but not a great film with a great plot but weak characters. And I definitely think the former is what we have here. That's not to say the film's plot is bad, it's just that it feels relatively standard. I mean, this is basically Three Amigos, but aimed at kids, so this story's been done before. And honestly, for a film that kind of markets itself on being kind of cutesy and lighthearted, it's surprising how dark this film can get with its humor. You know, the bug who kills himself by going into the bug zapper, the slug who accidentally ingests some salt, the play that the elementary school ants put on in which everybody dies. And honestly, I definitely dig it. And it doesn't even feel out of place because, let's be honest, being a bug would suck. So these almost out of nowhere cruel jokes don't feel out of place in conjunction with its generally cutesy tone. Also, can I just say that the score for this film is absolutely incredible? Because it's incredible. Some of the instrumentals really stuck out in my mind even years later. This might actually be one of Randy Newman's best scores that he's ever done. So okay, I hinted before that I don't think this film was perfect. So what are some of the issues? Now, I want to be clear that none of these sink the film, but they are definitely worth mentioning. Let's start with something minor. While most of the characters I find to be interesting and memorable and some of them get arcs, there is one character that I feel is way too bland and underwritten, and unfortunately, it's the main character, Flick. Now, he's not the most poorly written main character ever written. Functionally, he does serve the story's purpose and themes just fine, but I don't know, he just comes across as very bland to me. If I hadn't seen this film a lot as a kid and had it permanently ingrained in my mind, I'm not sure I'd be able to remember much about his personality, or even really his name. He's not bad, and the actor they got for him is alright, I guess, although he does do his annoying laugh way too much. But I wish he could have been better written. Especially when you look at their previous film and see them craft such an iconic and wonderfully written protagonist, and when you know full well what they're capable of, it feels kind of disappointing when they're not able to come the least bit close in their following film. There's also a scene that, okay, really needs to be addressed because I do have problems with it. Now, as many of you are aware, A Bug's Life is essentially a mistaken identity story. Characters, through a series of misunderstandings, find themselves in a sticky situation where they feel the best solution is to just lie and hope things work out. But then, almost inevitably, it all comes crashing down when the truth comes out at the worst possible moment. And yeah, that happens here. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can approach this scene, often called the liar revealed scene. But typically, especially in kids' films, the characters that were lied to will feel very hurt by the protagonist lying to them. They'll try to explain themselves, offer up some rationale for why they lied, but the other characters don't want to listen. They think that because they lied, that suddenly means that they have nothing worthwhile to say, and yeah, that happens almost exactly here with zero deviation, which I would be fine with if it felt more organic or earned or it had more justification, but it doesn't. Basically, the ants decide that because the bird idea was Flick's idea and not the warrior bug's idea, that it's suddenly a bad idea and decide to just collect as much food for the offering as they can. And I'm sorry, I don't buy this decision. I mean, sure, I can understand that they'd be upset at Flick for lying, but you spend months building this bird. You fully commit to building it, having plenty of time to think about whether or not this was a good idea. And the second that you find out that it wasn't made up by the person that you thought it was, you instantly dismiss it as a garbage idea. Like I said, I don't buy this. But I know why the writers did it. The story needed the circus bugs and Flick to get separated from the ant colony so that they can swoop in and save the day when the grasshoppers take over. But it doesn't change the fact that this scene and the motivation for the characters in that scene feel forced. It doesn't feel organic, and it's not a natural progression of the story. And unfortunately, it's not a minor scene that you can ignore. It's the linchpin that shifts the film from its second act to its third act. So the scene's not incidental. So yeah, that's one scene I feel drags the film to a screeching halt every time I see it. But okay, is one bad scene enough to ruin a film? In my opinion, no, especially when the rest of the film is so charming, so funny, and filled with likable and memorable characters up to that point and afterwards. Personally, I really enjoy this one a lot. Now, do I wish Flick was better written? Yes. Do I wish that one scene was written better? Oh, without a doubt. But I love just about everything else in this film, which is why I think it's a shame that it seems like one of Pixar's more forgotten films. I'm going to give Bug's Life a 9 out of 10. Also, I should mention upon rewatching this, I completely forgot about the scene where Flick tries to commit suicide by having Dibs step on him. So, yeah, Pixar was 2 for 2 for films in which a main character is driven to the brink of suicide. I honestly don't know what to make of this. Maybe one of the writers really needed to talk to someone. Toy Story 2, the sequel to the highly acclaimed first film that, in my opinion, does absolutely everything that a sequel could and should do, despite the fact that it had a lot stacked against it. For starters, this film doesn't just hit a reset button on the characters and the plot like so many sequels tend to do, but rather it actually continues the story in a way that fits the universe naturally, and the characters evolve in a different way. So they're not going over the same lesson that they learned in the first film. Imagine that, a sequel actually continuing a story rather than rehashing it. What has this world come to? And trust me, if you know anything about the film's production, like how Pixar once accidentally deleted the entire thing, and how with less than a year in production left, the entire film was rewritten and retooled from scratch, it is nothing short of a cinematic miracle that not only is this film good, but it turned out great. Like, phenomenally great. Now, in my opinion, I don't think it's quite as tightly written as the first film, but let me say, it is pretty close in quality. In fact, this film seems to be the complete antithesis of where sequels tend to slip up. Like many sequels, this one does introduce some new characters, and not just one or two, but quite a bit. But all of them are well written, memorable, funny, and or well acted, with the dark horse and biggest surprise being Jessie, The seemingly energetic and happy-go-lucky cowgirl who tries to mask her insecurities and PTSD over being abandoned and then locked away in storage for years underneath a cheerful facade and sarcasm. This creates a character that is both funny and tragic at the same time. And her voice actor, Joan Cusack, was a perfect pick, and she nails every single emotion needed for the character. And like I mentioned before, the themes, while in some ways connected to the first film, are different, so the characters aren't relearning the same lesson again. For example, in this film, Woody has to decide whether or not he should leave Andy and his friends behind, despite the fact that one day Andy will outgrow him, or if he should stay in a museum where he will be adored for decades and decades by children from around the world, but without the emotional connection that he has with Andy. It's actually kind of an interesting dilemma, and you can definitely understand why Woody is tempted by the offer to go to the museum. You can also understand why Stinky Pete goes to such extreme measures to get the other characters to do what he wants, even though he's the antagonist of the story. On top of that, this film touches on themes of abandonment, growing up, the fear that one day we may feel like we've, in a sense, outlived our usefulness in a relationship, and if we're offered an escape to avoid that inevitable heartbreak, would or should we take it? Like I said, these are kinda heavy themes, but the genius of this film is that it manages to do so in a way that it doesn't feel inappropriate for its target audience. On a surface level, you can just see it as a funny adventure film with great, memorable characters, but as an adult, you can actually dig deeper into the themes of the story, and you'll find there's quite a bit more meat to ruminate on. And on top of it all, it is a really funny movie. There are just so many great set pieces in this film. Honestly, this film is filled with memorable moment after memorable moment, from the traffic cone scene that I liked as a kid but had me howling with laughter as an adult. There's the airport baggage scene, the cars driving the pizza car, the elevator scene, the scene where Woody tries to get his arm back from Al, the scene where the cleaner fixes Woody, one of the most bizarrely satisfying moments in the history of animation, set to one of the greatest instrumental pieces ever composed. This whole film is just littered with great moments. And yet, despite all those great moments, this film still manages to have a standout sequence. The one moment that sticks out far and away as being the best scene in the film and a masterpiece in its own right. In my opinion, this is not only the best scene in the film, it's the best of the entire franchise. And that's Jessie's backstory. The utterly gut-wrenching sequence set to the soft ballad of When She Loved Me, sung by Sarah McLachlan. The raw emotion on display in this one scene alone is so powerful that those 3 minutes could have been its own short film and it would have provided the same emotional punch. Honestly, I don't even know what else to say about it that so many others haven't already. Most complaints I have are minor, like how did Jessie not see Stinky Pete put the remote control in front of her, or how did Andy's mom not notice that Woody was stolen? In my opinion, negligible things that one might pick up on only after watching it multiple times like I have. And I suppose one could make the argument that the new Buzz and Zurg really didn't need to be here. I mean, after all, they don't really affect the plot that much or feed into the themes, but I'm sorry, they're both hilarious characters and provide some much needed comic relief, and the film would feel incomplete without them. That said though, their inclusion does make the film perhaps a little bit more cramped than it should be, especially considering that there are so many characters, but only a tiny bit. Once again, this is me digging around looking for things to complain about, because the rest of the film is so fantastic. Toy Story 2 gets another 10 out of 10. It is rare that a sequel to an already beloved film turns out this great. But let's see if Pixar is able to continue that trend for the third installment. Because 2 fantastic films in a row is hard enough, but 3 is virtually impossible, and only the most skilled and talented of people could pull it off. We'll just have to wait and see. Monsters, Inc. Yeah, once again, taking a spin on a kind of story that's been done before, but tweaking it and making it its very own. The idea that the monsters in your closet aren't just monsters in your closet, but rather they're normal blue-collar workers just doing their job in order to provide energy for their city. It's a neat idea, and the film definitely takes advantage of its premise. And there is a lot that this film gets really right. For starters, this might actually be some of the best exposition I've ever seen in a film. Keep in mind, we have to be introduced to this brand new world from the ground up. So the film has to do extra legwork in the exposition category. And yet despite this, in less than 10 minutes, you get a feel for how this world operates, the energy crisis they're currently facing, and the relationship dynamic between the characters, and all without feeling like you're being front-loaded with a ton of information. And speaking of the character dynamic, that's another area where this film succeeds. The relationships are completely believable. Whether it be Mike and Sully, or Sully and Boo, or Mike and Celia, or Sully and Waternoose, or Randall and Fungus, they all feel so realistic. In particular, the relationship between Sully and Boo that grows feels incredibly organic. It never feels cheap or forced, and it really makes up the heart of this film. And actually, what's most surprising is that the film uses cliches that normally I can't stand, but they actually do them really well here. The engineered public confession is done here, which is normally one of my most hated cliches. But because of the dialogue in the scene feeling really natural, and because we've already had a proper climax for the other villain, it doesn't feel like a cheap cop-out. There's also the scene where Mike and Sully fight and the two decide that they won't be friends anymore, which again is another cliche that I can't stand, but in this instance it works out so much better because I can actually buy that the characters would do this. It doesn't feel out of character or out of place in the story. It actually feels like a natural progression. On top of that, the film's comedy is also on point. I mean, you gotta love the absolute irony of a bunch of scary looking monsters being deathly terrified of a little girl. And then there's the climax, of which there's technically two of them, one to take out each of the villains. One of them a more action-packed and original climax with the chase through the closet doors, and the one a little bit more conventional, but still no less emotionally satisfying. And since I haven't brought up Pixar's animation in a while, yeah, this is an extremely well-made movie. The world that they've visually created here feels so in-depth and thought out and lived in. And the aforementioned climax where the heroes and villains jump through all sorts of closet doors is a visual treat on top of just being exciting. There's also the animation on Sully, who despite having fur that would be incredibly difficult to animate, he apparently housed over 2 million individual pieces of hair on his body. He moves so well. You honestly would have never guessed that he was a pain to animate. Also, I have to give credit to perhaps my favorite scene in the entire film, and that's when Boo finally overcomes her fear of Randall to save Sully. That scene is both awesome personified and is really hilarious. So yeah, this is a film with a very clever concept, does a lot of things incredibly well, even stuff that I normally find annoying, so it deserves every single prop that it gets. With that said, I do need to point out some problems I do have. Now, one thing that needs to be said, and this is easily my biggest gripe with the film, is that the villain's evil plan is actually kinda confusing. I really couldn't follow it as a kid, but now that I'm an adult and have seen this film probably a dozen times, I can follow it now. Now, granted, I don't know if I can follow it just because I've seen it so much or if it's because I'm an adult, but I think it's safe to assume that most kids wouldn't be able to follow that part of the film very well. And that is something that the writers probably should have taken a closer look at. Apparently, there was originally supposed to be a scene where Sully stumbled onto a room filled with empty cages, which I think would have helped articulate much more clearly exactly what the villains planned on doing. But I don't know, maybe they thought that scene was too dark and so they cut it, but honestly, I think that scene would have helped the overall narrative. On top of all that, there are some conveniences that feel like narrative cheats. For instance, when Mike and Sully get banished, they somehow manage to go into the abominable snowman's cave, and then use a sled to travel to a town that normally takes a 3-day hike, then manage to find an active closet door so that they can get back, and then manage to do all of that in the time that it took Randall and Waternoose to walk from the banished door to the Scream Extractor. And there are hiccups in the world building if you stop and think about it too hard. For example, where do the doors come from? How are they made? If a child moves to a different room, do they have to make a new door from scratch for that child? How would the monsters figure this out? Why destroy a dead door? Just put it out of commission until it becomes a new kid's room. How did they get photos for the kids in the files? Where did the rumor about toxic kids come from, and for what purpose? Does Waternoose know? Does the CDA know? And of course, there's the question of if nearly every kid's closet in the world was activated at once like it was in the climax, Does this mean that several people, most of them children, accidentally plummet to their deaths because they entered their closet and weren't paying attention? But I should also point out that these were questions that only popped up after I had seen the film so much, which means the rest of the film is just so strong and so great that it did a fantastic job of distracting me from these questions. It knew how to direct your attention, which in and of itself is a hallmark of a great film. The only real true issue I have with the film is the aforementioned villain's plan being too complicated to understand, which, I'm not gonna lie, it's not a small problem, but I wouldn't say it seriously derails the film either. So if all that's said and done, Monsters, Inc. gets a 9 out of 10. Honestly, I don't even have much else to say about it. It's just a fun adventure film, spun from a clever twist with a real genuine heart. Finding Nemo is more than just another Pixar film. At the time, it was a cultural phenomenon, not too dissimilar to The Lion King of the 90s and Frozen of the 2010s. It came practically out of nowhere and became the highest grossing animated film domestically at the time, the highest grossing Disney film worldwide, and to this day, it still holds the record for the best-selling DVD of all time. So what was it that drove people nuts about this film? Well, first of all, especially for the time period this came out, this is a gorgeous film. I mean, I mentioned back in my Bugs Life review that Pixar had a problem with animating water. Let me tell you, that problem is non-existent here. The underwater world that we see is just so vibrant and colorful and feels so real, and you can feel the scope and weight of the ocean. The backgrounds look incredible and in-depth, and I could watch an entire film of just that alone. Honestly, it just boggles my mind that this movie is 20 years old, because the animation in this has aged beautifully. And the second is the story and characters. In particular, this has a story that can appeal to both kids and adults. Actually, if you think about it, this film is basically a G-rated version of Taken before Taken was even a thing. Really, the genius in this film's story lies in the way Marlin and Nemo's stories and character arcs mirror and complement each other. I mean, it could not have been easy to write a story in which the message is that parents shouldn't be overprotective of their kids, while said parent in question is trying to find his son after being kidnapped, or fishnapped. But what makes it somehow work is that when you think about it, Nemo's capture is ultimately both of their faults, at least to an extent. Marlin's butting in at the drop-off when Nemo was originally going to do the right thing was what caused Nemo, in a moment of anger, to go out into the open sea in the first place. And of course, Nemo is at fault because he does something incredibly stupid and dangerous for really no reason. As such, Marlin needs to learn not to be so overly protective lest he push his son away, while Nemo is forced to grow up quickly and learns that while his father may be afraid of a lot of things, he does love him and would do just about anything for him. And then there's Dory, played by Ellen DeGeneres. Now, let me say this right off the bat. A character in which her main gimmick is that she can't remember anything was risky, because that is a gimmick that could have gotten old really fast. But thankfully, due to clever writing, the charm and likability of the character, and the fact that DeGeneres is a talented comedian, not only does the character of Dory work, but she really, really works. And it really helps that unlike other comic relief characters in film, especially other animated films, she actually serves a function in the story. And not just because she can read, but it's because of her that Marlin comes out of his shell and learns that there is risk to life and that he can't protect his son from everything. But yeah, there is a good reason that people remember Dory and they quote her lines. It's because she's just such a great character. And while we're talking about the voice acting, we might as well talk about Albert Brooks as Marlin, who, honestly, you could not have cast this role more perfectly. Albert Brooks' neurotic personality and incredibly dry delivery translates very well to the character of Marlin. But he also manages to step outside his comfort zone and actually delivers a genuinely heartbreaking performance during some of the film's sadder moments. You can definitely feel the desperation in his voice anytime he talks about trying to find his son. And that's not even getting into the side characters, which there are a lot, but thankfully Pixar made them all so memorable by giving them fun or interesting personalities or quirks. I mean, what other film can you think of that has vegetarian sharks? A good film about vegetarian sharks. Also, I love this film's interpretation of the sharks viewing eating fish as an addiction, not too dissimilar to drug addicts. I mean, one of the sharks literally goes blood crazy after smelling just a tiny bit of blood, while the other two hold him back while screaming, "Intervention!" Also, I have to quickly add, when people talk about Up having easily the saddest opening for a Pixar film, do you even remember how this film opens? This is a very close second. The opening is absolutely brutal and probably as dark as you can get and still get away with a G rating, at least back in 2003. Now that I think about it, this is probably the only G-rated film I can think of that actually has blood in it. Like when Dory's nose starts bleeding, which, do real blue tangs have red blood? I'm overthinking it. Anyway, I don't have a ton of complaints, but I do have some minor issues. Like, the film story isn't as polished as I would want. For instance, the last that we see of Nigel is that he flies away thinking that Nemo is dead, but I guess it's inevitable that in a film with so many characters that some loose ends would slip through the cracks. There's also the fact that some moments are a little forced, like Nemo really didn't need to go into the fisherman's net to tell the groupers to swim downwards, or how the dentist is just staring out the window for something like 20 seconds while Darla is shaking the bag holding Nemo, or the contrivance of how Marlin and Dory just so happen to be taken directly to the place where the diver goggles landed. Again, mostly minor things, but things I feel are worth bringing up. But the film hits the emotional moments very well, it's funny, most of the characters are unforgettable, and it's paced extremely well. It's great, and I'm going to give Finding Nemo a very strong 9 out of 10. And when I say strong, I literally mean it is a hair's breadth away from a 10. If someone were to ask me to pick my favorite film with a 9 out of 10 rating, it would probably be this one. It really is that good. The Incredibles is perhaps the Pixar film I have the most interesting relationship with in terms of how my opinion changed of it as I got older. I mean, I liked the film well enough when I first saw it, but I think I mostly found it a little bit too long, and there were aspects to it that I didn't really understand, being only 9 when I first saw it. And I found it a little difficult to relate to some of the themes that were present. But as I got older, I found myself returning to it more and more, even though I couldn't really understand why at the time. And as of writing this, I've come to appreciate this film so much. And in some respects, you could even argue that this film was ahead of its time. I mean, this was a film that deconstructed a lot of elements of the superhero story. And this was well before superhero films saw a massive resurgence thanks to the MCU. But on the topic of how it handles the superhero stuff, I have to say, I love how this film touches on stuff that we normally wouldn't think about, or at least didn't at the time the film was released. For instance, the fact that Mr. Incredible gets sued by the very same man whose death he prevented in an attempted suicide, which ends up snowballing into a series of other lawsuits that causes superheroes to go underground, definitely feels like a thing that would really happen in our world. Speaking of which, I also really enjoyed watching retired supers kind of looking back on their superhero days, viewing them as the glory days, while they partake in vigilante work on the side. I don't know, it just adds a level of realism to me. But anyway, let's segue into talking about the animation. Now, this was Pixar's very first film after 9 years as a studio to be focused solely on human characters. I mean, sure, they'd animated humans before, but this was the first time their film was solely about humans. And putting the humans in this film side by side with the humans in, say, Toy Story, really shows how far Pixar has come in animating humans. And I think what helps it here is that the humans in The Incredibles are somewhat stylized. They don't try to make them look too realistic looking. Otherwise, that might have looked uncanny. And this film once again reminded me, as if I needed a reminder after seeing Into the Spider-Verse, that superhero films seem practically made for animation. The action scenes in this film are all tight, clear, focused, and because the entire film is CG, there's not any moment where something can look fake and thus take you out of the scene. But seriously though, these action scenes are great. Whether it be Mr. Incredible's first fight with the robot, or Dash and Violet trying to escape the henchmen, or Elastigirl getting stuck in the doors, these are all great sequences and showcase the potential for CG animated action scenes. And honestly, some of these action scenes can get kinda brutal. This isn't a film where the carnage is restrained or anything. No, no. People die, and it is made very clear that they die. Yeah, it's kind of crazy looking back on this film and realizing how adult this film is. And I don't mean adult, like saying the F-bomb over 100 times kind of way. I mean, the subject matter leans more towards adults. Even the film's main theme about dealing with the midlife crisis, and even some of the plot points, like how Helen suspects that Bob is having an affair, or even the satire early on with the insurance company, or the aforementioned lawsuit, really speaks more to the adults in the audience rather than the kids. Now, that's not to put this film down. On the contrary, I actually like these elements a lot, or at least now I do. Even the pacing seems more adult. This was by far the longest Pixar film to date at the time, and while the film is definitely never boring, there are some scenes that give the viewers time to breathe and let them soak in what they've just seen. Each scene is pretty much exactly as long as needed. The pacing in this film is just impeccable. But, and I think most people can agree with me, a film about a family of supers isn't going to be as strong if you don't buy the family dynamic. And thankfully, that is absolutely not a problem here. The family that we see on screen feels exactly like a real family. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. The way they talk to each other, the way they all treat each other, the way they fight with or alongside each other, it all flows and fits together so perfectly. And that's not even getting to the comedy, which is on point, and there are some genuinely hilarious scenes in here. Like Frozone's argument with his wife, or in Mr. Incredible taking his anger out on his car, or just Edna Mode. Just the entirety of Edna Mode. Seriously, she's my favorite character in the entire film, from her design, to her voice, to her personality, to her dialogue. She is, in my opinion, one of the best characters that Pixar has ever created. With all that said, if there is a concern to me, it's that even though this film is called The Incredibles, this film does put a lot more focus on Mr. Incredible, especially in the first half. In fact, there's like a 30-minute period where Dash and Violet barely appear. Now, in my opinion, this doesn't really hurt the film, but I don't know. I feel like maybe they could have been in the film just a little bit more in the second act in order for the film to be absolutely perfect. There's also a couple of times where the villain Syndrome has a golden opportunity to kill Mr. Incredible or the entire family, but he doesn't because reasons. Like I mentioned before, there are aspects of this film that kids really aren't going to get. This is a film aimed more at teens and adults rather than kids. That's not really a complaint though, as I kinda wish more Western animation would put more of an emphasis on entertainment for teens or adults without going overboard with the adult content. But I do think that this is something you should know going in. So yeah, this film works as a subtle deconstruction of superhero stories, works as a film about family and teamwork, works as a film about a man struggling with a midlife crisis, has great action scenes, is exceptionally plotted with memorable characters, and is overall a fun, enjoyable experience. The Incredibles gets a 10 out of 10. It is just such an incredible movie. No, I'm not apologizing for that pun. Cars is sometimes singled out as Pixar's first weak film after a decade of classic after classic. And while I do think this was their weakest film up to that point, and its reputation has taken a hit in recent years, I'm going to defend this film just a little bit. Now let me say right off the bat, I am not going to pretend why I don't understand why some people don't like this film, especially when compared to so many of Pixar's other films. I mean, Pixar seems to pride itself on telling stories that appeal to both kids and adults, sometimes even leaning more adult than the kids, but with this film, they seem to be aimed primarily at kids, with the appeal of adults being almost entirely a few adult jokes that'll fly right over kids' heads, rather than for the plot or themes. And yeah, most everyone has pointed out that this plot is a G-rated version of Doc Hollywood, and the fact that the world-building aspects of this film are confusing. For example, how does the car's anatomy work? How do they procreate? How did they create their societies? And also the fact that this film inspired a ton of really, really terrible ripoffs and copycats. For some reason, cars with faces on them is ripe for low-quality animation studios to rip off. So that begs the question, what exactly do I like about this film when there are so many legit reasons to dislike it? And I know this is going to sound crazy to some of you, but I really like the ambiance of this film. One of the things that this film does a great job at is capturing the look and feel of a small town. The coziness, the community that forms around it, the slower, down-to-earth pacing and feel, and the vibes. The characters that make up that small town of Radiator Springs feel like denizens of a real small town, which is helped by the fact that they got some really talented character actors for the parts. I think everyone has their own type of cinematic comfort food, and this one just does it for me. Now, does this film have, say, the complexity and depth of any of Pixar's previous films that came before it? Not especially. I mean, the lesson of taking the time to slow down and appreciate the beauty and joy of life without going all fast all the time is a pretty surface level message, but I wouldn't call it a bad message by any stretch of the imagination. Now, granted, that message is kind of undercut by the fact that this film is distributed by Disney and how this film is a merchandising and consumerist juggernaut. But I will stand that the first film I do think was made with the best of intentions, both as a love letter to cars racing and small towns, and as a desire to pay tribute to Route 66. A mercy that I will not grant to a certain sequel, but we'll get to it when we get to it. So yeah, this film is probably a prime example of a film where if you're able to accept the premise and the world for what it is, then you'll probably like it fine. But if you can't, then you're really not gonna like it. It's really that simple. Honestly, I'm not even really sure what else I can say about it. I mean, I guess the only other thing I could do is ask the question of what exactly this film gains by having this film be a world inhabited only by cars. I mean, sure, the plot would mostly play out the same. Pretty much the only difference here that I can spot is that because McQueen is an actual car, Radiator Springs has the ability to siphon out his gas so that he can't make a run for it. So the only thing left is the surplus of car jokes and puns, some of which range from lazy, like the Nice Butte bumper sticker, a gag that was recycled from Toy Story 2, by the way. But there are some clever jokes in here, like the gag about how the women's restroom has a long line of cars while the men's restroom is moving at a fast pace, or the groupies that flash Lightning McQueen with their headlights. Honestly, I wish I had more to say about this film, but it really is just that simple. But sometimes something simple hits you right in the cinematic palate. I'm going to give Cars an 8 out of 10. Is the rating this high because of nostalgia? Partly, and I will freely admit that. But I still stand by the fact that I only view this as a weak film when compared to Pixar's other films. And I get that. We hold Pixar to a higher standard because we know how great they can be. But I still found this film just too charming and funny for me to disrecommend it. This is a good standalone film that works just perfectly fine on its own. And I can only hope that even if Pixar did decide to make an unnecessary sequel to it, that they would at the very least keep true to the feel of what made this film so likable. I mean, making a sequel to a film that feels nothing at all like the original film? Who would do that? Ratatouille. Yet another Pixar film that, while I did like as a kid, I've come to appreciate way more as an adult. I guess Brad Bird's films just tend to have that effect on me. If I were to describe this film in culinary terms, I'd describe this as a glass of wine. Meant to be savored, can be sweet, but also has a bit of a kick to it. And while yes, there are a few minor elements that are a tad unpolished, that does not in any way detract how clever, intelligent, entertaining, and surprisingly adult this film is. I mean, what other kids film can you think of that has an out-of-wedlock child being a crucial plot point, as well as a scene where the villain tries to ply the hero with alcohol to get information? Or a scene where a woman fires a bullet at her lover, but then immediately embraces him afterwards. Because Paris. And that, I think more than anything, is why I love this film so much. It truly and honestly feels so unique in terms of tone, in terms of pacing, and even in terms of plot. This kind of premise of a rat who wants to be a gourmet chef and uses a human as a puppet to accomplish his goals is something that really could only work in animation. But the flow of the story and the themes that it touches on are something more akin to live-action indie drama. While on a surface level this film is about cooking, what the film is actually about is this human desire to create, the desire, the perhaps even necessity of creating something great, something rich, and putting it out in the world in order to make life just a little bit more pleasant. which is actually why I think a lot of YouTubers in particular have singled out this film as one of their favorites. This is a film that specifically speaks to artists of all kinds of different backgrounds, whether it be the lowly artist that comes from a humble background, or the critic who makes a living analyzing other people's work. And a connection I've never really thought about, but it does kind of make sense, is that I've heard many people describe this as being the fountainhead for kids, which, yeah, I can definitely see. The main character, Remy, is definitely a nonconformist, both in terms of what makes both a good rat and what makes a good chef. He doesn't care if you think something's not going to work. He is just so confident in his ability that he's going to do it anyway, refusing to compromise because his way's the right way to do something. Also, can I take a moment to point out just how delicious all the food looks? Note to self, which I'm likely going to ignore anyway, never ever watch this movie on an empty stomach. You will regret it. As is par for the course for Pixar at this point, the characters are memorable and well written, especially Colette and Ego, the former of which is both hilarious and intimidating, the latter of whom is just plain old intimidating. And the animation is just stunning. I mean, you really feel like you've been transported to Paris. It's tightly paced, has good laughs, and it has a good heart, blah blah blah. You already know all this. It's almost become cliche at this point to mention this for Pixar films. And finally, this film has perhaps the most perfect ending to any Pixar film. It is a perfectly bittersweet ending with an emphasis on the sweet. Things may not work out precisely how the main characters wanted or envisioned, but even so, even in a circumstance that was less than desirable, they managed to achieve their goals and dreams, and in many respects, they probably wound up even happier as a result. It's a perfect ending to a mostly perfect film. As mentioned previously, there's a couple of minor issues that could have been ironed out, like how when Remy is reunited with Emile, he goes into the kitchen and steals some food instead of, the food that Linguini just gave him, or how Linguini somehow managed to get through an entire dinner rush without Remy's help after he told Remy to get some air. Or that kind of weird moment where Remy asks Gusteau's ghost why Linguini would be filed with his will, and the chef replies, "This used to be my office," as if that in any way answers the question that Remy just asked him. I don't know, maybe that was supposed to be a joke, but that line always felt kind of off to me. Or why Remy thought it was necessary to try to convince Colette that Linguini was awake when he fell asleep from trying to close up the previous night. Overall, pretty minor things. And those small issues do not in any way diminish the film's quality. Ratatouille gets yet another 10 out of 10. It's a fine piece of filmmaking, one of Pixar's more mature films in a good way, and good fun on top of that. I wish I had more to say about it, but it's just a film that works. If you only saw this as a kid, give it another chance as an adult. I think you'll find there's more to admire than you remember. WALL-E. I have to admit, it had been quite a while since I had seen this film, possibly even as long as a decade. So, I was genuinely excited to give this film another go. And yeah, I loved this movie when I first saw it, but rewatching it again with fresh eyes was a downright euphoric experience. I forgot how smart, clever, charming, and downright adorable this film really was. And honestly, I don't even know how I forgot, because this film is just perfect. Yeah, I'm saying it. Upon reevaluation, I will defend this as a perfect film. Much better than I had remembered. One thing that a film will get major props with me for is if you're able to convey so much with so little. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about film is the possibilities with straightforward visual storytelling that's really not possible with any other medium. In my opinion, exposition is one of the hardest things to get right in movies, especially if you're trying to establish a whole new world, because if you try to front load the viewer, it can feel exhausting, and that is typically when most writers violate the show don't tell adage, and bad exposition can take me out of a story, even in otherwise great movies. This problem is non-existent here. In the first 40 minutes, we get a feeling for this world, the central conflict, the personalities of the two leads, and it does so with very limited dialogue, often playing out kind of similar to the silent films of the 20s and 30s. And yeah, they're both great characters. Wally is curious and inquisitive, but he is kind of naive. Eve is a tough, no-nonsense robot who's focused on her mission, but isn't joyless by any stretch, and she shares Wally's curiosity, just to a lesser extent. And their dynamic is absolutely perfect. Most people seem to agree that the film's first 40 minutes of this film are cinematic perfection, managing to establish a real tangible connection between the two robots with very little dialogue. And a lot of people tend to think that the second half of the film peters out when they go to the Axiom. I don't agree with the latter. Wall-E, when you get down to it, is a film about loneliness and isolation, and the second half does a good job at highlighting a different kind of loneliness, one different than Wall-E's, feeling isolated from other people, but still being surrounded by other people. This lack of human connection and human touch, despite them being all around you, and not even knowing that you're isolated. On top of that, the second half of the film still has and maintains what makes this film so special, and that's the relationship between Wall-E and Eve. Tell me, Pixar, I want to know how you did it. I want to know how you managed to create one of the most tender cinematic romances in less than 90 minutes, and with characters both having very limited dialogue and limited facial movements. Because I'm not kidding, if you were to make up a list of the greatest film romances in history, the list would feel incomplete if you did not include Wall-E and Eve. Their dynamic is absolutely perfect, and what's most important is that buying their romance is easy. It is extremely easy to believe that Wall-E would fall in love with her because, well, she's the first robot that he's seen in literal centuries. And she doesn't fall in love with him right away, but slowly over time grows to care for him greatly because he continuously and without question puts her needs over his. But that's not all. We also have Jeff Garlin's portrayal as the captain, a character who might go down as one of Pixar's most underrated characters. I mean, when he's going through what's essentially a wiki walk on the internet about what life used to be like on Earth, his energy and desire and that thirst that he has for knowledge is infectious, and he's got the same energy as a child on Christmas Day. But then he also proves himself to be forceful and assertive when he has to, like when he orders Otto to show him a classified video, or when he engineers a way to escape out of his room. Seriously, I just love this character a lot. And all the other characters, to be honest. And the on-point comedy. And how this film creates a desire for me to actually go out and do stuff and live life. And it does it without feeling preachy. Seriously, I have been looking and struggling to find something, anything to complain about. Even in the most nitpicky way, as I've been wont to do. Finding some chink in the armor, but I can't find one. Is the film a bit on the nose with its environmentalism and anti-consumerism themes? I don't think so. It doesn't dwell on them at all, and the film doesn't lose focus on what it's actually about. And to be frank, this might actually be the best film about environmentalism I've ever seen, and I think it's because the story was written around the message, not the other way around. Is Otto a weak villain? He's a computer program just following orders. He's not really meant to be a fully fleshed out antagonist. He serves the needs and purpose of the story just fine. If you were to ask me if I were to change a thing about this film, the answer is no. To me, that is a sign that a film is absolutely perfect, which is not something that I can say about even many of my other favorite movies. Wall-E gets an easy 10 out of 10. This is just such a pure emotional experience and is not only one of Pixar's best films, this is one of the best films, period. If you haven't seen it in a while, like I hadn't, revisit it. You won't regret it. Up. Okay, can I just take a moment and point out that Up is perhaps the most bland and generic title out of all the Pixar films? That just always bothered me, and I just wanted to get that out of my system. Anyway, how's the movie proper? I mean, a movie starring a geriatric widower who uses balloons to carry his house off the ground and travel to South America? Come on, that's gotta be fodder for some really goofy and silly film with no dramatic moments whatsoever, right? Well, that's exactly what I was thinking before I first saw it, and very quickly I realized I was very wrong. Not only is this a compelling and sorrowful film about grief, it is perhaps one of the very best, most gut-wrenching moments in the entirety of Pixar's films, and you know what I'm talking about. It's the sequence showcasing Carl and Ellie's married life as they grow old together in an incredible sequence, showcasing their life, the ups and downs, their personalities, and ultimately how their time together ended. It's an absolutely beautiful moment that takes you on a roller coaster of emotions very quickly without subjecting you to emotional whiplash. This film has the most perfect beginning out of any Pixar film. But, and this is something that needs to be addressed, the rest of the film doesn't quite match the brilliance of that opening scene, which does mean that the film does emotionally peak maybe just a little bit too early. And this is something that has been called the up effect, something that if you start a film too strong, it can make the rest of the film seem weaker by comparison. But I want to be very clear. I said only in comparison. This is still a great movie with a lot of poignant moments and memorable characters, and even some moments of great comedy. And while yes, some of these moments of comedy are a little simplistic, it's what they do with it that makes it work. For example, they speed up Alpha's voice to sound like Alvin from Alvin and the Chipmunks. But because he looks like an intimidating dog, the contrast of the image versus the voice takes what would have been an amusing joke into something genuinely funny. And while we're on the subject, this film just completely nails the personality of all the dogs. If I was forced to guess exactly what dogs were thinking or saying, this is pretty close to what I would say. Carl Fredricksen is just such a great and smartly written character. It would be so easy to dismiss him as just your stereotypical grumpy old man, but thanks to the clever writing and the incredible performance of the late Ed Asner, there's actually a lot more dimension to him than you would think. And most importantly, the film goes to great lengths to make you sympathize with him even when he makes mistakes, which he does. This is a dynamic and interesting character. Also, am I the only one who noticed that his original plan was just an incredibly complicated and fantastical suicide attempt? I mean, he planned to make it to Paradise Falls or die trying, and once he made it there, he had no method of getting himself back or a way to sustain himself. So, yeah, I think he was almost certain that he wasn't coming back. Anyway, and then there's the relationship that forms between him and Russell. Now, kid characters are difficult to write, especially if they're supposed to come across as annoying to one of the main characters, because, let's be honest, if you go overboard on the annoyance, then you'll end up annoying the audience just as much as the other characters, if not more so. But, once again, Pixar has found an exceptionally perfect balance. Sure, he may annoy Carl through his antics, but because they actually gave him funny lines to say, and because they got a very talented kid actor to play him, and this is very important, because he comes across as genuinely well-meaning in all of his interactions, even when he screws up, it never, for 1 second, comes across as annoying to the audience. And the relationship that grows between him and Carl is the heart of the story, as Carl, who had given up on ever having any kind of positive interaction with a human, slowly lets his gruff exterior down, and the two of them form an extremely believable father-son dynamic, and it doesn't feel forced. Charles Muntz is also a great villain, one who has an understandable motivation, and if you take the interpretation that I do, that the decades of isolation, all in a vain effort to prove his peers wrong, have driven him completely and utterly mad and paranoid, then his villainous turn is actually pretty tragic, and you can't help but feel a tinge of sympathy for his plight, despite all the monstrous acts he ends up committing. This is how you write a complex villain, and to do so in such a short and succinct runtime. And I haven't even gotten just how visually stunning this film is. The backgrounds and the trees and the scenery of Paradise Falls all look gorgeous and are brimming with color and life. And Kevin's animation is just stunning, moving and sounding exactly like a real giant bird would act, on top of just being beautifully designed. Only real problems I have with this film are the tiniest of nitpicks, like sometimes the film has issues balancing the comedy and drama. Not every joke quite gets the laugh the film was hoping for, but like I said, these are nitpicks. If you're able to buy the film's premise, of which I can understand it might be difficult for some people, then you are in for an exciting, funny, poignant, and touching adventure that will stick with you long after the credits end. I'm going to give this film a rock-solid 10 out of 10. This film is proof that you can take a film with the premise that, to be completely honest, sounds pretty stupid and far out there, and make it into something timeless and beautiful. It's just amazing. Toy Story 3. Now, I will fully admit, back in the late 2000s when I heard this film was being made, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, okay, Pixar has finally run out of ideas. A sequel released 11 years after the previous film. There is no way that this is going to be good. But then I actually saw the film. Now, the stereotype that sequels that happen more than a decade after the previous film tends to be awful is not unfounded. But what separates this film from all the others that do the same thing is pretty minor, all things considered, but it's this. This film actually had a purpose in waiting that long. Toy Story 2 raised the question of what will happen when Andy outgrows his toys, and this film, it actually addresses the issues head on. We actually get to see the scenario play out that we knew was coming and the characters knew was coming. This is once again a sequel that is a natural progression of the story and characters, not a rehash. It addresses the darker side of the Toy Story universe, like how the toys who love and care for their owners feel when they get casually donated or thrown away by the same owners. And while yes, it was addressed in Toy Story 2 with Jesse's backstory, here the issue is dealt with more in depth. I mean, this is a kid's film that directly deals with the issue of abandonment, and not as a minor thing, but as the central theme running throughout the film, and it flirts with some really dark material. I mean, Lotso Huggin' Bear might very well be the most despicable and monstrous villain of Pixar's entire catalog. There is nothing redeeming about him whatsoever. He is a sociopathic, misanthropic tyrant who runs a daycare with an iron fist, whose only goal and dream in life is to break and crush the spirit of any and every toy that comes across his path until they are just as unhappy with their own existence as he is. And all just because his previous owner replaced him. He even rejects a chance at redemption gift wrapped to him on a silver platter because he really is just that rotten to the core. But yeah, Lotso is Pixar's greatest villain, specifically because of how not pulling his punches evil he is. Because he ties in so well to the themes of abandonment with the film, and because he works as a great foil for Woody. Yeah, really think about this for a second. The reason why Lotso became so bitter was because his owner replaced him, something that Woody can relate to because he went through basically the same thing in the first film. But whereas Woody eventually came to reject his jealousy and actually grew as a person, toy, Lotso let it completely consume him until he was nothing more than a shell of his former self. Lotso is a cautionary tale of what Woody could have become if he hadn't corrected course. And on top of it being a dark film dealing with the fear of abandonment, this film works as a fun prison escape movie. Now, I love me a good prison escape movie. The different methods and watching the moving parts fall perfectly into place is a lot of fun and is exhilarating to watch when it's done right. And yeah, it's done very right here. It's exciting, it's inventive, the film takes advantage of its setting and characters to have a prison escape story that you really couldn't in any other genre. And yeah, I suppose we should talk about that scene. You know the one. Okay, technically I could be referring to two scenes because a lot of people say the ending broke them in tears. And yeah, I do think the ending is really, really good, but I wouldn't say it wrecked me emotionally. The incinerator scene, on the other hand, broke me. The first time I watched this scene, I was legitimately worried that Pixar was going to have the cojones to actually kill off their main characters. The scene really is that intense and pulse-pounding, and there is something so disheartening about watching people who know they have no chance of escape and can do nothing but just sit there, hold hands, and wait for death to take them together. It is a fantastic scene and a true testament to Pixar's storytelling that we don't even care that the scene is technically resolved via a literal deus ex machina. And I should also point out that Pixar once again knows how to balance these characters so well. Yes, there are a lot of them, but it never feels like these characters are given the shaft. They fit and flow together so perfectly and form a single cohesive unit and bounce off of each other so well and are given a great amount of screen time and things to do. And also, this film perhaps has the best rendition of Barbie ever put to film. Where else are you going to see her snap someone's neck, tie them up, and then torture them? Yeah, in a G-rated way, but still. But yeah, this film is touching, it's funny, it's exciting, it's dark, very dark to be honest, and it's a natural progression and quasi-conclusion to the story. Once again, any issues I have with the film are the tiniest and most minute of nitpicks, like how Slinky was somehow able to escape the pull of the magnet after it went past the shredder, or how Barbie was able to ask the bookworm for the Buzz Lightyear instruction manual without him figuring out that she wasn't Ken. Overall, minor things. In terms of theme, story, character, ideas, and pacing, everything else about this film was pretty much spot on. It gets yet another 10 out of 10. And it is with this that the Toy Story trilogy ends with a perfect 10 out of 10 for all three of their films. One of the most perfect cinematic trilogies of all time. But if Pixar did decide to make a fourth film, we know that they would only do it because they felt they had a story worth telling and not just as a quick cash grab. Wow. So that's 11 films in a row that are really good with barely any complaints in sight. Sure, they may have had one film that wasn't great, but in my opinion, it is still a pretty good movie. And that was 4 10 out of 10s in a row. That's impressive. Really impressive. It's stupendous. So, I am sure that Pixar will continue that hot streak and continue to make classic after classic. Oh, right. You're next. Cars 2. Yeah, okay. So, I said before that I liked the first Cars film, and I was willing to defend it, but yeah, I won't and can't defend this. This is a huge step down in quality from any of the 11 films that came before it. And it managed to single-handedly end the most impressive run of movies by any one movie studio in existence. And it did so not by being not great or even just by being mediocre. It actually did so by being bad. Not incredibly bad, but still bad nonetheless. Pixar's hot streak wasn't gradually diminished. It ran smack dab into a concrete wall, crashed, and burned. Yeah, like Lightning McQueen in Cars 3. But maybe I'm being unfair. After all, maybe the reason people are so harsh on this film is because, well, we do expect more from Pixar. We expect so much. So the added disappointment might have made it a touch overhated. And I do want to try to give credit where credit is due and not just rip it to shreds needlessly. But still, let's do something I haven't done in this video yet. Let's start with the negatives. And trust me, there are a lot. So yeah, let's get this out of the way. This movie's a ripoff of The Man Who Knew Too Little. And a blatant one at that. So, I guess since the first film ripped off Doc Holliday, it only makes sense that this film rips off yet another 90s comedy. And while yes, I like that film fine, even I have to admit that they were already stretching it thin by the end. So, already this premise is completely worn out before the first frame even begins. That's a good start. And the second thing that needs to be brought up is, okay, do you remember how simple, down-to-earth, and humble the plot of the first film was? It showcased the importance of slowing down and appreciating your humbler roots and not getting sucked in by the razzle-dazzle. So okay, how do you go from that to Spies? So you saw the first film, you took one look at it and thought to yourself, you know what kind of film the sequel should be? A James Bond parody. These pieces do not fit together even a little bit. And thirdly, now we have Mater as the main character of the movie. Now, I like Mater fine as a character, in small doses, and that's how most comic relief characters tend to work. They're fine in small amounts, but they really can't hold their own movie. They were designated comic relief for a reason. But, believe it or not, Mater is actually not the dumbest character in this movie. That title actually belongs to Finn McMissile. So you set up that this guy is one of the greatest, most intelligent British spies in the agency, and yet he, for some reason, can't figure out that Mater is actually not a spy, even when he tells it to him to his face on multiple occasions. There is a reason that when you set up characterization that you need to keep it consistent throughout the other story, because if it don't, it makes the characters look like idiots, or that your writing is very sloppy. Yeah, the writing in this film is extremely poor. So let me see if I can get this straight. According to this film, the message is that Lightning McQueen needs to learn that he should accept his best friend for who he is. Okay, no problem so far. even when said best friend is being loud, obnoxious, not having any kind of social awareness or respect to the culture and customs of the foreign country that they're visiting. No. Mater's not the one who needs to change and try to improve himself. It's McQueen for, rather patiently in my opinion, trying to steer Mater in the right direction and only getting mad at him, in my opinion correctly, for costing him the race. Okay, that's where you lost me. Like, yeah, friends should accept you for who you are and all that jazz, but sometimes there's a reasonable expectation that your friends should be on their very best behavior. Different situations require different levels of social tact, and Mater does not even try to tone himself down. And you're not just there as McQueen's friend, you're also there as part of his crew. You represent both him and his brand, and you need to be cognizant of that. This aspect of the film in particular makes Mater come across as completely lacking in self-awareness and even kind of unsympathetic. And then there's the villain's motivation. Now, let's ignore for a second how blatantly unsubtle its anti-big oil message is and how, out of place it feels in this world occupied by cars. So, the villains in this film are lemons. Basically, cars that are extremely poorly designed due to manufacturing defaults. Or I guess in this universe, because they're born that way, I guess. And they're upset because they're worried that alternate fuel will overtake oil and make them useless, and the parts that keep them running won't be made anymore, or something. Honestly, it's not even really that clear. So, lemons in this universe are basically the world's equivalent of disabled people, which has all sorts of implications that I am not going to touch, so you can draw your own conclusions there. So, anyway, they're worried about alternate fuel overtaking gas and oil, which, first of all, is never going to happen in this universe that's occupied by cars, and second of all, who exactly manufactures all these spare parts, how they're made, and why would this group or company suddenly stop making those items even if most cars switch to electric, especially if it's apparently keeping some lemons alive or able to function or whatever. And apparently, because All in All was a scam the entire time, alternative fuel wasn't even that big of a presence or threat to gas and oil in the first place. So, the villain's plan is completely and totally nonsensical from basically every single angle. Nothing about it makes any sense whatsoever. And I haven't even touched on the film's smaller problems, like how Doc Hudson pretty much ignored, barring a single 30-second scene to explain his absence, how almost all the characters from the first film are completely shoved to the side and have almost nothing to do with the plot, or how the race is built up throughout most of this film as this very big and important thing, only to be unceremoniously dropped without any fanfare by the time the climax rolls around. Or the graphic scene of brutal torture that, if it wasn't for the fact that these characters were anthropomorphic cars, would not be out of place in an episode of 24. I'm not kidding, it's actually kind of disturbing, way too much so for a film that's aimed at really little kids. So yeah, MPAA, a character being tortured and burned alive on screen and then being crushed into a cube are A-okay in your book, right? But the biggest question I have is just, why? Why does this film even exist? And no, because toys is not an acceptable answer, and apparently it wasn't. Because this was a film that John Lasseter really wanted to make. But still, making a sequel to what was already considered your studio's weakest film seems, I'm not gonna lie, a little bit tone deaf. And I get it, John Lasseter is a car person, and this franchise was something of a pet project of his, but sometimes you have to look beyond that and put that aside. Unless you had a really good, brilliant idea for a sequel, this should have stayed on the page, or, barring that, handed off to a lower animation studio and released straight to video, where, honestly, this film belongs. But okay, I said that I would give this film a fair shake, and not just bash it mindlessly. What are some of the positives of this film? Because, I'm not gonna lie, there are some noteworthy things in here. Well, like most Pixar films, the film is stunning to look at. It may not push the boundaries and limits in terms of what CG can accomplish like many of their previous films, but the landscapes are wide, vast, and gorgeous. A lot of the futuristic spy tech is practically made for animation, so the film looks nice. So that's a plus. Also, it is kind of nice to see Radiator Springs have more hustle and bustle. After watching an entire film with the town dying a slow and painful death, I had to admit it was nice to see it busy. It just made me feel warm inside. I also liked the villain's backup plan when their initial plan to kill McQueen doesn't work. It was actually pretty clever. The climax itself isn't really too bad, with some moments of fun action. I gotta admit, one guy having a bomb inside of him and trying to get far away from his best friend as possible in order to save him while his best friend is ruthlessly chasing him down is a unique set piece. I will grant the filmmakers that much. And this is actually the one thing in the movie's favor of it being a spy film set in the Cars universe, is that we actually get some fun and unique car chase scenes. Although I wish that aspect of the film had been better utilized. There are a few funny quips here and there. Not as much as I would have liked, but at least it's not a complete black hole of comedy. And some of the spy concepts aren't terrible, they're just not well utilized. The problem here really is the writing, but yeah, I'm sorry, that's a pretty big problem. Now, this isn't even the worst writing ever. Trust me, I have seen way too many awful films to know that this doesn't even touch those. But still, some of these decisions are just baffling. Because, well, this is a Pixar film. These are the same people that gave us classic after classic after classic, and for them to make rookie mistakes that professional writers should not be making and not thinking through their implications well, that is something that I just straight up do not understand. I mean, sure, not every studio is perfect, and it was inevitable that the Pixar dynasty would come to an end at some point. But I think most people expected a gradual diminishing quality, not a sudden deceleration that caused horrific whiplash. Yeah, this is a bad film regardless of the company that made it, but it does sting even more knowing precisely where the film came from. Cars 2 gets a 4 out of 10. I don't hate this movie. I know a lot of people do, but I don't hate it. If I absolutely positively had to watch it again, it wouldn't make me want to burn my eyes out or anything like that. In my opinion, it's just run-of-the-mill bad. And if this was made by any other studio in the world other than Pixar, nobody would care about it. I mean, even less so than they already do. Brave is without any shadow of a doubt Pixar's most divisive film. There really is no general consensus with this one, so you're probably wondering what I thought of it. Prior to making this video, I had seen this film once, way back when it was first released in theaters, and I liked it fine at the time, but I never really felt the need to revisit it. So, now that I'm older, I've seen a lot more films, and my taste in cinema has changed, I thought maybe this film might grow on me just a little bit more. And I have to say, rewatching it again after a decade has finally made me realize something. I used to be way too generous on films back in the day. Yeah, not only was this film not as good as I remembered it, it was actually worse. So what's wrong with it? Well, believe it or not, it's actually not a lot of problems. It's actually mostly just one problem. Just one single problem that permeates throughout almost the entire film. But it is kind of a biggie. Merida is a terribly written protagonist. She is just the worst. When you're writing a main character, you have to craft a character that is either compelling or likable. Both if you're able, but typically one or the other is what you strive for. There are plenty of great movies that have total scumbags as the protagonist, but because they're so compelling and well written that you don't care that they're unlikable, you just enjoy watching them. Now, let me be absolutely clear. I understand that Merida was written to be a brat that learns the error of her ways by the end. And normally character arcs for the main characters are the way to go, but my gosh, you need to give them some likable and sympathetic traits at the start so that we want them to change for the better. And this is also very important. You need to make sure that their bad actions are not, morally reprehensible. So let's talk about Merida's plan for a second, and I'll tell you why this character really got under my skin. So her plan is to cast a spell on her mother in order to change her so that she doesn't have to marry. So yeah, she literally wants to brainwash her own mother. So her initial plan right from the get-go is really, really horrible. Now that's bad enough. That's not even taking into account that Merida is messing with something that's incredibly dangerous and powerful that she has no experience with, magic. But let's set that aside. So, Then she gets this cake, or whatever it is, and then the second she returns home, her mother, who has calmed down quite a bit since their big argument, expresses relief over her daughter returning home and shows that she's willing to forgive her for the outburst. And how does Merida respond to this? She gives her mother the cake anyway, without the tiniest flicker of remorse or hesitation. So then the mother eats it and starts feeling bad. Like really bad, like worse than the worst stomachache you've ever had in your life. And once again, how does Merida respond to her mother being in severe physical pain? She just keeps on asking if she's changed her mind about her needing to get married. Repeatedly, even as the mother gets worse. And then when the mother turns into a bear, what's Merida's first response to this? Oh no, this wasn't my fault. The witch is the one who did this. Seriously, am I supposed to hate this character? Because every single action that she's taking here is making me actively dislike her, and not in the way that the filmmakers intended. And this is something that a lot of writers need to hear, but this one especially needed to hear. Just having a strong female character as the main character does not automatically make us root for them. You need to actually give them traits that is going to make the audience like them. And you certainly can't just have them do whatever they want with impunity and then still expect the audience to side with them, even if they do change by the end. And here's the thing. Merida, to an extent, has a motivation that an audience, in theory, should be able to get behind. You know, not wanting to get into an arranged marriage, which is a trope that's been severely beaten into the ground by this point, even back then. But let's set that aside because I want to approach this from a different angle. So, Merida wants the freedom to be able to just go and do whatever she wants without being held down with a man, which, okay, that's fine, but she's also a princess and essentially part of a very wealthy family, especially for that time era, and that's what gives her the ability to have that freedom in the first place in this point in time. And with being a princess comes responsibilities and duties. So the way that I view this character is that she wants all the freedom that being well off allows her to have, but none of the responsibilities that come with it. It really does kind of make her come across as an entitled brat, especially when her actions of quote-unquote shooting for her own hand nearly leads to a full-scale war between the clans, which she either knew would happen but didn't care, which actually does not look good on her part, or she didn't know that it would happen, which, yeah, makes her look like an idiot. Seriously, how on earth does Pixar, of all companies, the great animation studio that has crafted some of the most compelling, dynamic, likable protagonists for the films, drop the ball this badly? Upon re-examination, as of the writing of this review, Merida stands as being the single worst protagonist that Pixar has ever created. At least Mater in Cars 2 was somewhat likable and had some charm and meant well. Yes, I am saying that I dislike Merida more than Mater. That might be controversial, but I don't care. That's my opinion and I'm sticking to it. And I'm sorry, a movie can survive a lot of things. A poorly written protagonist is not one of those things, especially since that one problem usually bleeds over into the other problems with the script, typically when it comes to the writing. But I've complained about this enough. I've got a couple of other things that I want to complain about, most especially the comedy. Now, let me be absolutely clear. This film's not completely devoid of comedy. There are actually a couple of chuckle-worthy moments here and there, but more often than not, it really feels like they fall back on broad, poorly timed slapstick or crude humor, which, I'm not gonna lie, feels too lowbrow for Pixar. Their comedy is usually smart, sharp, sometimes even hidden in the background for eagle-eye viewers, but here the comedy just doesn't feel like there was much effort put into it. So, okay, as you can probably assume, I don't like this movie. I don't think it's a good film, and after coming off the heels of the astoundingly stupid Cars 2, I wanted something stronger to help get back on track. This was not it. But I do need to be absolutely fair for this movie. Overall, this is still not the worst thing ever. Not by a long shot. It's not even the worst Pixar film. And it does have some redeeming value to it. For starters, I actually do enjoy the general mood and atmosphere of this film. You really do feel like you've been transported to Scotland, and it's got some beautiful backgrounds. And there is kind of this feel for the mysticism and folklore that surrounds this tale, and it's intriguing and it draws you in. On top of that, Billy Connolly as Fergus. I got nothing more to add, he's just an awesome character. And actually, more often than not, he gets the film's funniest lines. And also, that hair. Merida's hair is simply gorgeously animated. Apparently, Pixar had to create a brand new animation software in order to properly animate it, and by golly, it looks beautiful. It really feels like you could reach out and touch it. And I will admit, the film's third act is actually not too bad. It's actually kind of compelling. It's kind of interesting to see the more action-oriented heroine being forced to use her words and diplomatic abilities to resolve a situation peaceably. But later on, the more peace-oriented and diplomatic mother is forced to use violence to save her family. It's a great contrast that has the two of them finally come to an understanding as to what the other side is coming from in their rationale and why they are the way they are. But even so, I can't bring myself to overlook those pretty significant issues I had with the first two films and with Merida specifically. Sure, she changed, but that doesn't change the fact that for the first 2/3, I did not enjoy watching her. I didn't want her to change. I didn't find her compelling or interesting or funny or anything. Sorry, I meant to end this review on a bit of a high note, but I really can't help it. It's just a very, very mediocre film. There's potential for a great film in here, but the writing for it just wasn't there. Brave gets a 5 out of 10. Whew. Made it. I made it through that entire review without mentioning Brother Bear once. Monsters University. So, after 2 dud films in a row, maybe it takes them revisiting one of their beloved classics in order to get Pixar back on track. Does this film succeed? Mostly, but it's also nowhere near the quality of the original film. And in fact, it does do that kind of annoying thing that prequels tend to do where they showcase something and go, hey, remember this from the first film? But overall, this is a competently made and put together film, but there are a couple of things missing here that prevent elevating it to the classic status of the previous film. But let's start off with the positives because after the last 2 reviews, I need it. The film's biggest strength is its ending and its message. Now, it's a message that you don't often see in films, period, let alone for kids, and that's that sometimes, even if you work for something, you're still not guaranteed to succeed, and it can be something as simple as you're just not made for it, or it requires something that can't be taught, and you just have to have it. Now, this isn't a message that we see very often in media because it's kind of a tough pill of a message to swallow. It's not a feel-good message at all. So typically the inverse message is seen way more in media, even in other Disney films. So it is refreshing to see a film that has the message of, yeah, you won't always accomplish your goals in exactly the way you want, and sometimes not even at all, even if you work for it, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with failure. Use it, own it, and find out what you were made to do. It's a message that actually reminded me a lot of Wreck-It Ralph. You know, the first one. When people talk about Disney and Pixar trying to break away from older stereotypes, this is actually more the kind of stuff I want to see. And on top of that, I actually do like a lot of the new characters. The Uzma Kappa characters are likable and charming, and they have distinct personalities, and they're fun to watch. There's also some minor expansion of how certain aspects of this universe operate. I actually love the librarian monster who wraps her tentacles around everybody who makes the tiniest bit of noise and literally throws them out of the library, and she's got a really cool design. And it is kind of interesting to see the dynamics slowly form between Mike and Sully and how they contrast with each other. They both want to be scarers, but Mike has to work and study in order to even have the slightest chance of succeeding, but Sully really doesn't, and in fact, he feels like he can just kind of skirt by on his family name and legacy. And this film goes to great lengths to showcase how the two of them working together form a cohesive unit, and how you can buy how these two wouldn't really like each other at first due to their different backgrounds and approaches to scaring. But then gradually they grow to respect each other and realize that the two of them really need each other if they're going to succeed. It's actually pretty clever. But I mentioned before that this film is missing a few key things that prevent it from being great, and if I'm going to be honest, it's the emotional heart. The emotional moments don't hit quite as hard as they should, especially when you compare it to the original film, with the relationship and bond that forms between Sully and Boo. That's not to say this film is bereft of heart, but it doesn't have as much impact as it feels like it should. There's also the fact that this film does tend to fall back on a lot of school film cliches, like the nasty jock bully who's just a jerk and he's not really that funny or memorable, or the loser gang who puts themselves out there in order to prove their worth and gosh darn it, they're gonna give it their all. Yeah, we've seen all this before and they're not really doing that anything unique with it. And also, for a film that's set almost entirely at a university, I was shocked at how tame this film is. This film actually got a G rating, and if I'm gonna be honest, I feel like this is the rare instance of a Pixar film that it actually needed to be PG. It needed to be just a little bit edgier in order to make it feel like a real college. Now, of course, I'm not expecting Animal House levels of drinking and sex or anything like that. Obviously, this is a kid's film, but still, I had a really hard time believing that this was a real university because of just how safe and sanitized everything felt. There's really only a couple of jokes that capture the feel of college really well, like that one monster who's guzzling down pots of coffee right before an exam, or that one gag that gives a slight wink to beer pong. But aside from that, there's really not that many jokes or moments that make this feel like a real university, at least none that take any real risks. Honestly, there's a Monsters University short that played before Muppets Most Wanted in theaters called Party Central. It actually captured the spirit and utter mayhem of a riled, raucous college party extremely well. And it took advantage of the world that the series takes place in order to do it. And guess what? It was actually rated PG, and it earned it. That's the kind of stuff I wish was in this movie because it would have made the world feel more complete. But then again, that's not really the focus. The focus is on the message and watching the dynamic form between Mike and Sully. And I kind of get the feeling that after Cars 2's terrible reception, that Pixar was kind of afraid to take risks, and you can kind of feel that here. But it does take just enough risks, and it tells the story just fine enough that it manages to work, even if it doesn't reach the heights that we know Pixar is capable of. I'm going to give Monsters University a 7 out of 10. It is kind of a run-of-the-mill movie, which is disappointing, but hey, at least it's a step up in quality from their last two films. Run-of-the-mill and generic is still better than being either mediocre or bad. Hey, maybe we'll be lucky and the next film will be an improvement. Inside Out. Now, I will freely admit, by this point, I'd given up hope that Pixar was ever going to put out anything as good as they once had, at least anytime soon. I thought that Pixar had run out of steam or ideas, but then I saw this. I was completely blown away. Not only was this film much better than any of the three films that preceded it, I find it to be one of their very best films, period. This film actually holds the distinction of being the film I've seen the most in the theater. Granted, I worked at the theater at the time, so I got in for free, but I think it's noteworthy that I found this film so great that I willingly saw this in theaters 4 times. So, what was it about this film that makes it so great? Honestly, what doesn't make this film great? I mean, this is a film all about the personification of emotions. This is a premise that seems tailor-made for Pixar, and thankfully they take advantage of that in this film. Apparently, the filmmakers consulted with real psychologists in order to try to portray as accurately as they could the mental process of a young girl, and that hard work really shines through. I mean, the entire film, when you really boil it down, is about watching a young girl slowly begin mentally shutting down due to attempting to repress her emotions. And I've heard from multiple different people that this film's illustration of depression, how you lose your ability to feel both happiness and sadness, and only feel angry, disgusted, and fearful until you can't feel anything at all, is one of the clearest, most accurate, and most straightforward depiction and illustration of depression, not just in kids' film, but in media in general. And yeah, this film actually did help me more clearly understand what people who suffer from real, genuine depression are feeling and experience. So yeah, I think this film has the potential to be a positive force for good on just that level alone. But not only does Pixar use this as an opportunity to tell a surprisingly mature story about depression, it also uses it as an avenue to tell all sorts of clever jokes. like the facts and opinions looking too similar, to how certain catchy jingles can randomly get stuck in your head, to even the reason for why some of your dreams can seem so nonsensical or even kind of off kilter. Shout out to the film's incredibly subtle reference to MST3K. I've loved it so much. Now, the one area I was concerned about before watching this was that I was worried that the characters, in particular the emotions, would be too one note and would get old very quickly. But thankfully, the fact that the emotions are able to experience a mild range of emotions beyond their core ones, and because they all cast the roles so perfectly, not only are they not annoying, they're all charming and likable, even when they take actions that under normal circumstances would really bother me, but in the context of this film, really doesn't. For instance, I would normally get onto the main character of Joy for being way too mean to Sadness at the start of the film, but because it's within the context of illustrating Riley's mental process of trying to suppress sadness and covering it up with faux happiness, this just makes perfect sense. And the way they viewed the world is very consistent with how an 11-year-old might see it. For instance, anger implanting the idea for Riley to run away to Minnesota so that she can create more happy memories is a plan that we, the audience, know is doomed from the start, but the logic that he uses to justify this decision is very much kid logic. Something that kinda sorta makes sense or feels like it would make sense when you're a kid. And speaking of which, I'm actually trying to think of another kids film that actually portrayed relatively accurately a young child trying to run away from home and without turning it into a joke. I can't think of one. They even included a scene of Riley sneaking downstairs and stealing her mother's credit card. Couldn't believe what I was seeing when I first saw it, but I was glad that Pixar included it. I was even so sure that I was gonna hate Bing Bong, and yeah, he did get on my nerves a little bit at first, but as the film progressed, I finally realized what his purpose in the story was, and it was to illustrate how focusing or holding on to too much of your childhood can hold you down and keep you from growing, and you have to let them go in order to fully grow and mature as a person. And yeah, his final line in the film will make you feel bad for ever having a negative thought about him. This film also looks amazing. Aside from the designs of all 5 of the main characters, and they look really distinct and visually match their personalities, but the world that they've created here feels so rich and thought out. This world showcasing the inner mechanisms of Riley's mind feels, for lack of a better term, lived in. And even on the surface level, this film is just gorgeous to look at with the vibrant colors, and it just pops and none of it ever clashes. And finally, there's the film's emotional climax. The scene where Sadness takes control of the console, allowing Riley to finally start grieving the loss of her old life and begin the healing process. This, and I'm not exaggerating here, is my favorite moment in all of Pixar's films. The pure and raw emotion that fills me up every time I watch this scene, it simply can't be described. Now, I haven't mentioned this before, but I do not cry easily while watching films, like, at all. In fact, I can't even think of any film where I was actually crying, like, real tears while watching it. And there's only a handful of films that actually made me genuinely teary-eyed, and this film is one of them, and it's specifically because of this one scene. The build-up leading to this one moment throughout the entire film, the incredible score by Michael Giacchino, the powerful, striking visuals, which is able to say so much, and communicates the weight and heaviness of the moment without a single line of dialogue, is just so incredible, and it gives me goosebumps every time I see it. And the way the scene ends, in which Riley lets out this sigh of relief after being embraced and comforted by her parents, after Joy and Sadness touch the console together, so perfectly captures a feeling that is seldom talked about, but we know is there. Yeah, you know, that strange feeling of happiness that comes from grieving the loss of something with people you love and grieving it together. And it manages to illustrate it without a single line of dialogue. I love it when films are able to convey these complex ideas in such a straightforward way without feeling like it's being watered down. And this one scene in particular showcases the power that film, animated or otherwise, has. This ability to move an audience so thoroughly that you're able to convince us that not only do these fictional characters exist, but that they're alive and that they're breathing and that they feel. I mean, this was already a great film before this moment, but any tiny doubts or reservations that I might have still had were destroyed by the time the climax appeared. Really and truly, any problems I have with this film are the tiniest of nitpicks. First, there was a Chinatown reference that was a little bit too forced for my taste, and secondly, the imaginary boyfriend standing on each other's shoulders was maybe a little bit too silly. Yeah, I know, it's a cartoon, but maybe that one element went just a little bit too far. But honestly, that's it. Those are the only things about this film that I didn't love to pieces. This film is the definition of a masterpiece. It, of course, gets a 10 out of 10. This is just such a rich and emotionally fulfilling experience. This is one of the very, very rare films that I will watch anytime, anywhere, and I will never get sick of it. I just love it. The Good Dinosaur. Honestly, what can I even say about this film? No, I'm serious. What is there to say about this film? The film is a very basic boy and his dog story, just with a dinosaur and a little boy in the respective roles. I remember when I first saw this film back in theaters, I couldn't help but think that something about it just didn't feel right, and then I heard about how this film had a notoriously troubled production, and yeah, you can definitely see that in the finished product. There are so many elements from several different versions and rewrites fighting against each other that it's kind of difficult to get a handle on this film. The pacing for this entire film just feels off-kilter, either moving way too fast or way too slow, which is pretty insane because when you really get down to it, the film's story is about as simple and straightforward as you can get, probably more so than any other Pixar film. There's not really that many subtleties or hidden layers to the story that you can read into as an adult. It's just kind of this generic journey story. I'm not even really sure what the purpose was in having the framing device that shows the asteroid not hitting the Earth and not wiping out the dinosaurs. I don't know why they thought that was necessary since it doesn't really factor into the story. Now, with that said, I do kind of like the idea that the dinosaurs are the more advanced species in this world. In fact, the humans in this world kind of act like dogs, but at the same time, I'm going to be honest, I don't get it. Are they implying that because dinosaurs didn't get wiped out, that humans evolved into dog-like creatures? How would that even... You know what? I'm not even going to try to figure this out because it's probably just going to make my brain hurt. Now, the one element I can definitely praise this film for is the backgrounds. If you were to look at a still frame image of just the backgrounds in this movie, there are certain assets and certain frames where you could be tricked into thinking that this was live action. The backgrounds really look that realistic. But then it also kind of does the film a disservice because the dinosaurs and human characters all look extremely cartoonish and they contrast heavily against the setting and they stick out, and not in a good way. It is very distracting, and it's baffling to me that nobody thought that this might be an issue. The backgrounds either needed to be a little bit more cartoonish or the characters needed to look more realistic so that the two blended together. Having extremely cartoonish characters in front of a stunningly realistic background just looks off. But ultimately, if I could summarize this film in one word, it would be watchable. It's a passable time waster while you're watching it, but because of how simple the story, characters, arcs, and everything is, and because the film does at least look nice, it does go down pretty easy. But the film is lacking in key moments. I actually forgot quite a bit about this film before I sat down and rewatched this again. I had completely forgotten about the pterodactyl villains or the velociraptor villains. The one moment that I did remember was the one scene where Arlo and Spot eat some hallucinogenic fruit and start seeing all kinds of surreal imagery. Honestly, I'm not even sure what that scene's doing in the movie. But anyway, the fact remains that this film is kinda forgettable. I don't want to say it's bad because in my opinion, it doesn't really make that many mistakes, but at the same time, it doesn't really have that much lofty expectations. And again, I think that some people were kind of harsh on this film because it's Pixar, but taking that out of the equation, I find this film to be not bad, but not really good either. Honestly, if you're in the mood for a Pixar film that's light on substance, is low commitment, and it still at least looks pretty, it's not a terrible film to check out. Now, is that a ringing endorsement? Not really, but I didn't dislike it either. I'm gonna give the film a 6 out of 10. I wish I had more to say about this film, but there's really nothing more to say. It's just a film that keeps your interest kinda while you're watching it, but it won't be remembered. Finding Dory is a sequel that was released 13 years after the original film, and it was a sequel that I didn't really know that I wanted. I mean, yeah, I really liked Finding Nemo, but I wasn't so sure the story needed to be continued. I mean, where exactly do you go from how the last film ended? But I'll tell you, this film won me over pretty quickly. Now, is it as good as the first film? No, there are a few areas where the story could have been more polished, but if you were to ask me if I saw this, if a Finding Nemo sequel released over a decade after the original would have been this good, I wouldn't have believed it, even with Pixar at the helm. On top of that, this film basically does what Cars 2 did, in that it made the comic relief the main character of the story. But it works here for a number of reasons. The first of which is that, well, one, Dory is a much better written character than Mater, but also there is a story about Dory here that's worth telling, namely her backstory and the struggles that she has to endure because of her short-term memory loss. In fact, this entire film feels like that it's exploring the darker side of Dory's disability, namely how she got separated from her parents and eventually got to the point where she couldn't even remember that she was lost. It really does truly show just how much having short-term memory loss like Dory does would hinder her everyday life. But another thing that really helps is that Dory is given great characters to bounce off of. The one that stands out by far the most is Hank the Octoseptopus, who is essentially acting out Marlin's role from the first film. You know, the grumpy old sourpuss who's terrified of everything, but after his interactions with Dory, slowly softens up and comes to accept her friendship. Also, he's voiced by Al Bundy himself, Ed O'Neill, so that alone is perfection. Also, I need to point out that his animation is just stunning. Probably the most impressive bit of animation I've seen in any CG animated film. If you know anything about CG animation, and you know how a real-life octopus moves, you know how complex and difficult he must have been to animate. Apparently, the animators spent 2 years trying to figure out how to animate his very first scene because they were just so devoted to getting it right. And yeah, his movements are incredible. Hank acts and moves just like a real octopus, and it is stunning. Something that I really appreciate about this film is that, like Inside Out before this, there isn't really an antagonist to fight. The central conflict is 100% character driven, and the conflict comes from the situations and the character's own limitations. That, in many regards, makes the story feel more grounded. And while, yes, I do enjoy having a good, nasty villain, sometimes it's refreshing to just see a movie that doesn't really feel the need to have an antagonist. Indeed, the antagonist, if there really is one, seems to be Dory's insecurities and anxieties. I mean, when you get down to it, this is a film all about living with a disability and trying to stretch beyond that and make it so that it doesn't define you while also accepting your limitations. Like many of Pixar's films, this one has several incredible knockout scenes that really stick with you. The film's emotional climax with the shells is such a beautiful scene as you slowly come to the realization of what's happening before it just hits you. There's also the scene right before that where Dory suffers from what I can only describe as a panic attack, and the way the scene is animated and the sound work all do a really good job of selling the emotion of the scene. You know, how things kind of move both slow and fast at the same time. I don't know how they did it, but it's just such a great scene. And the incredibly goofy climax at the end actually does a good job of diffusing the rather harsh-ish material from earlier, and winds up ending on such a high note. One thing that Pixar is exceptional at is balancing both the comedy and the drama, and this film is no exception. A laugh never really feels out of place, and they know how to ease you into the darker material without it feel like it's out of place. While this film isn't as funny as the first film, it does manage to get in some funny moments. Like the quarantine fish all freaking out over one fish sneezing, the sea lions on the rock, or Dory's hiding in a bucket filled with dead fish. On top of that, the film mostly moves at a really good pace. The motivations for the characters are consistent and never wavering, and yeah, just like the first film, visually it's just stunning. In fact, it's actually more stunning, which just goes to show just how far Pixar has come in terms of animation. Now, like I said before, there are some areas of this film that are unpolished. Like, the first 10 to 15 minutes has some really rough pacing. Like, there are scenes that legitimately feel like they're taken from the trailer. Marlin and Nemo are largely irrelevant to the plot this time around and are really only here because realistically they would tag along with Dory. Although I actually have to admit, it is nice to see the two of them stick together for almost the entire film and watching them bounce off of each other. And also, this film takes place a year after the first film, and yet Nemo has not aged one tiny bit. I get it, you want him to look the same as he did in the first film, but that one element really distracted me. Maybe if they said 4 or 5 or maybe even 6 months I could buy it, but 1 year, no, he'd look a little bit older. Not the biggest problems in the world, but definitely things worth taking note of. But overall, I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was a lot of fun and genuinely heartwarming. And like so many other Pixar films, it knows how to balance the funny, lighthearted moments with the sad moments as well. I'm going to give Finding Dory a 9 out of 10. Everything was against this movie working, so the fact that it actually comes pretty close in terms of quality to the first film is remarkable and worthy of praise. Cars 3. Now, of course, when I heard this film getting announced, I thought Pixar did not learn their lesson after Cars 2. But that might have been a little bit unfair of me because actually this film's not too bad. Certainly nowhere near as bad as their previous film. In fact, all things considered, it's actually pretty decent. Not perfect, not as good as the first film, but for a sequel that didn't really need to exist after another sequel that didn't need to exist, this is far better than it had any right to be. So, for starters, this film doesn't make any references whatsoever to the previous Cars film. Now, it doesn't do anything to actively contradict it, but you could legit skip Cars 2 and go straight to this one and you'd be able to follow it just fine. Also, this film goes back to the simpler and more humble roots of the first film, telling a more down-to-earth, slice-of-life story about a race car, recognizing that his time as a racer might be coming to an end, and how the new technologies that are designed to help new and upcoming racers have passed him by. The pacing is a lot more in tone with what the first one was going for, and yeah, it's pretty welcome. Yeah, I know, a sequel that actually understands what the first film was trying to accomplish and respects it. That should not be a high bar, but considering Cars 2 exists, it's apparently a thing that needs to be said. Also, this film goes pretty well into the mentorship relationship between McQueen and Doc, and the film actually deals with the latter's death head on rather than simply being relegated to just one scene and never being brought up again. Here, it is very relevant, and it ties into the theme so well as feeling like a genuine send-off to the actor Paul Newman. And it is kind of nice to see more of an expansion of this world, like this world's interpretation of a Demolition Derby, which by the way is a legit great scene. I also think that the student-mentor relationship that forms between McQueen and Cruz feels very tangible and real. And the film does touch on a theme that, again, you don't see in a lot of kids' media, and that's how do you know when it's time to retire from something? Throughout the entire film, McQueen feels inadequate and feels like he's past his prime and how it's all downhill from here. Which, if you look at the critical slump that Pixar was in at the time, I can't help but draw real-life parallels between McQueen's struggles and with Pixar maybe struggling with the same questions of inadequacy or whether or not they'd peaked and if they were ever going to recapture the magic of their older products. But yeah, this is a struggle that doesn't typically get highlighted in kids' films, so it's nice to see here. Also, much like The Good Dinosaur, the outdoor backgrounds look amazing. The textures that look so real that you could swear some of the shots are live action. But unlike The Good Dinosaur, where the characters stood out too much, here the characters actually blend in with the environment a lot better. So yeah, this film actually seems like something of an apology for many of Pixar's previous mistakes in their recent films. But this film does have missteps of its own. As I was watching this, I couldn't help but think of the many different directions this film could have taken. For instance, right after McQueen's near-fatal accident, which is a great scene, the film suddenly skips ahead to months later, and I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I feel like the 4-month gap could have been its own movie, showing Lightning's recovery and the frustration that he feels. I don't know, that element felt really glossed over, and I thought that was a missed opportunity. The film's plot and his motivations make just as much sense if Lightning had just come in last place in the final race. There's no fear from him that he'll get into another wreck or how the accident permanently damaged him and that racing is dangerous for him. What I'm saying is that this should have been split into two movies. The real Cars 2 should have been about a horrific accident that Lightning has on the racetrack and having him try to heal and overcome it. And then you could have had this Cars film about him accepting that he's simply getting older and it's time for him to retire. I also do have a couple of issues with the climax that I really feel like need to be talked about. Now, the ultimate conclusion that McQueen comes to is a good one, and you can see the seeds for it being planted pretty well and naturally. How he sees that Cruz should be the one racing instead of him, and how the student has essentially become the mentor. Yeah, bringing the series full circle. But I don't know, racing one car in the woods or on dirt roads and then immediately jumping into a professional race with dozens of cars, those are two very different things. Now, at the very least, we do see her struggling at the start before she gains the confidence to do a lot better, so it did at least get that part right. Also, this rule that cars can just swap mid-race has not been established before this. There was absolutely no indication that this was a thing that could even happen, and it's weird. It would be like doing a cross-country race, but then switching with someone halfway through while no one else does. It doesn't seem plausible or really even that fair to the other racers. And I get what the film is going for. McQueen recognizes that his time as a racer is over and that he can't compete with the younger generation anymore, so he gives the opportunity to Cruz, who never really got a chance to prove herself. I feel like that segment could have been a little bit more intelligently written because, as is, it kind of comes out of nowhere and not in a good way. And honestly, I kind of have the same problem I did with Cars 2 in that the citizens of Radiator Springs feel severely underused. I get it doesn't make sense for them to tag along with McQueen for his training, but it feels like this film doesn't really know what to do with them, and that bothered me. Still, like I said before, this is far better than I thought it would be despite all the issues I had with this film. And upon rewatching and revisiting this film, I found that the issues weren't quite as bothersome as they were the first time around. I'm going to give Cars 3 a 7 out of 10. All in all, it's a fine conclusion to a series that managed to go out on something of a high note after it made a major stumbling block. Best I can sum up, it's good, but not great, but there are some great things in it. So take that for what it's worth. Probably going to get drawn and quartered for this review. Okay, Coco. Yeah, I've already hinted before that this is probably going to be my most controversial opinion in this video. So I want to iterate right from the beginning that I do like this movie. I think it's pretty good. However, I do think this is Pixar's most overrated film. Again, overrated doesn't mean bad, it's just that I don't think it's as good as a lot of people say it is. Alright, so please bear with me as I try to explain myself. But yeah, let's get the positives out of the way first because, yeah, truth be told, there is a lot to like here. For starters, this film is gorgeous. This might actually be Pixar's most visually stunning film, and that is saying something. The Land of the Dead is such a beautifully vast world that feels so, if you'll excuse the pun, lived in. You can tell that a lot of effort went into making this feel so incredibly massive and large in scale, and it really works. Miguel is also such a great and well-written character. He is one of the most dynamic and realistic and yet still likable young boy protagonists, not just in Pixar's films, but just any animated film in general. Typically with child characters, the writers either make them too saintly and perfect or too irritating and obnoxious. But Pixar found a way to make him, in some respects flawed, but still likable and easy to root for. The film is also kind of nice, it has a generally pleasant feel, and it does have some nice, heartwarming moments, and it is nice to see a more in-depth look at an American animated film at a culture and practice that we don't typically see in media, and it's nice for it to get some exposure. I felt like I came away from the film with a much deeper understanding of the practice of celebrating Dia de los Muertos, why it exists, and the cultural relevance behind it. And personally, my favorite scene is the one where Hector sings one final song, which is a bawdy little ditty I might add, to his close friend right before he's forgotten and fades from existence. It really is an incredibly powerful moment. But yeah, you've heard most of these compliments from before, and that's not going to surprise you. So, what keeps me from loving this film as much as so many others? Well, It's the story. Now, don't get me wrong, I like the idea of a young living boy crossing over to the land of the dead and trying to get back home. It's the impetus for the entire plot that I don't like. It's your typical story of how the young one in the family wants to pursue his one passion in life, but his family just keeps trying to squelch his dream, and they don't listen, and it culminates in them destroying the symbol for said passion. And come on, this has been done before. Like, a lot. And by the time this film came out, I was really starting to get sick of it. So, yeah, that really annoyed me. I was also bothered by just how by the numbers and predictable everything was. This film, when you get down to it, has two separate plot twists. Now, the first one was actually legit surprising and I didn't see coming. And I will credit the writers for that one. The second one, however, was so obvious, I was able to predict it less than 30 minutes into the movie. And yet, by the time they reveal it, they hold on this twist. Like, they're letting the moment really sink in like it's the most unexpected thing ever. And I don't know, that just really rubbed me the wrong way. I was also not a fan of how the main villain was defeated. I'm in general not a fan of the engineered public confession trope, and I rarely see it done correctly. Monsters, Inc. is about the only film I've seen that's done this trope okay, but yeah, I'm not a fan of this trope because of just how lazy it is, and because there's no suspense whenever it's used. The instant that you see a camera within the general vicinity, you know exactly how the main villain is going to be taken out, he's going to be exposed, the general populace that once revered him is suddenly going to turn on him, and yeah, we've seen this before. So yeah, that also really annoyed me. There's also the fact that this film just isn't really that funny. Most Pixar films have a great balance of comedy and drama, but this film just didn't make me laugh. I think I laughed, maybe once in this entire film, in case you're wondering it was the "what did I miss" line. Though, to be fair, the film doesn't really have a high emphasis on comedy, so that's actually less of a concern. But it is still worth noting how many times this movie tried to make me laugh and just failed. Also, I'm probably the only person on planet Earth who the ending of this film did not make me cry. It didn't even make me the least bit teary-eyed. Yeah, it's a nice, sweet moment, but it did not trigger any waterworks in me. Yeah, I know, I'm a cold, heartless cynic, but I'm not gonna lie to you how I felt about a scene, even one as universally beloved as that one. So, even though I just went on about the issues that I do have with this film, yes, I do like it. It's a good film. I actually enjoy a lot of the characters, especially Miguel. The film is gorgeous, and it does actually move at a pretty good pace, and there are a few surprises here and there, just not as much as I would want. Overall, it's a good, solid kids film, especially if you want to use it to introduce them to another country's culture. Personally, I think a lot of the issues that I have with this film really just come down to personal pet peeves. Everybody has cliches that drive them mad, and unfortunately, this film has several that really get under my skin. When this film is great, it can soar, but ultimately, that level of greatness just doesn't hit as consistently as I want it to. I'm going to give Coco a 7 out of 10. Now, I can understand why so many people really like or even love this movie, but for me, it just did not grab me like I wanted to. Now, it did grab me, and I was interested, and I wanted to know what was going to happen. And this is a shame, because I thought maybe this time around, rewatching it again, I would have an even deeper appreciation for this film, but no dice. I liked it about the same now as I did when I first saw it. I don't know. I think everyone just has that one Pixar film that they think gets overpraised, and for me, it just so happens to be this one. Incredibles 2. Not The Incredibles 2 for some reason. There's no "the" before Incredibles, so it's just Incredibles 2. That's kind of annoying. Anyway, released a full 14 years after the original film, this was the one Pixar sequel that everyone wanted to see. Mostly because the world of superheroes is so vast and it has potential for so many possibilities. And thankfully, it's a film that actually takes advantage of it. For starters, we do get to see a lot more superpowered beings this time around, and their powers are actually really cool. And when they fight with each other, we actually get to see some really inventive fight scenes. Now, I will say the one element for the first film that I felt could have been stronger was the family connection, and thankfully this film makes up for it. we actually get to see the family interact with each other a lot more, and it's very welcome here. This film is a good showcasing for when doing a sequel is a good idea, namely to take advantage of opportunities that you couldn't capitalize on with the first film, either due to time constraints or because of the story. And the time away from this series led Pixar to really honing their craft in terms of animation. The first Incredibles film is kind of muted and does have a kind of dull color palette, and the action scenes feel pretty gritty and not really that cartoonish. But here, the colors just really pop off the screen, and the action scenes are a bit more in line with what we expect from superhero films today. And I gotta say, and again, this film showcases the benefits of animated superhero films, because when you're given the opportunity to animate the action scenes, you can get some amazing shots. And a lot of it is because, well, the entire thing is CG, so you also don't have to worry about it being realistic like you do in live action superhero films. You can just worry about it being visually stunning, and you can also control the camera and get the shot from whatever angle you want. And so it allows for a lot more creative freedom. But whether it's Elastigirl trying to chase down a runaway train or the fight on the cruise ship, there is not a stinker action scene of the group. On top of that, this film is also really funny. Sometimes all you need to get a good laugh is just have wonderful personalities bounce off of each other. And thankfully, the world of The Incredibles just has a lot of great personalities. Whether it be Frozone, who thankfully we get to see more of in action this time around, or Edna Mode, or any of the Parr family, especially and most surprisingly, the baby, Jack Jack. I'll admit, I was a little confused when I first saw the film because I was wondering why his family was acting like they didn't know that he had powers, but then when I rewatched the first film, I realized, yeah, they never saw his powers come out, only Syndrome did. So yeah, that was actually kind of clever. But yeah, while we're mentioning him, Jack Jack is just such a great character. Do you know how hard it is to have a baby character be the highlight of your film? That takes some mad skill to pull that off. But he's funny, his facial expressions are excellent, everyone's reaction to his powers is priceless, and his fisticuff with the raccoon is one of the highlights of the film, feeling like its own Looney Tunes style cartoon right in the middle of the movie. And his relationship and dynamic with Edna Mode was something that I didn't know I needed in my life. So yeah, the action's great, the characters and their interactions are great, it's funny, it's heartwarming, and it's visually popping. What's not to like? Well, there are just a few issues with the film, a couple of minor nitpicks, and one major problem. One nitpick is that, yeah, this film does kind of fall into the same pitfall that a lot of sequels do and have something akin to a reset button. For example, the parents do kind of have to relearn the lesson that their kids are capable of taking care of themselves in a fight, how Violet has to regain her confidence back after Tony's memory gets erased. Granted, it's not a major part of the film, but if you notice it, it's still kind of distracting. There's also the backstory of the Dever parents, and it's stupid. I mean, the guy knew for a fact that supers had been made illegal, and yet he tried to call them on the hotline anyway, and they wouldn't have gotten there in time anyway, and there was literally a panic room right there that they could have just ducked into. Why even have that panic room if you're not going to utilize it for literally the only time you would ever need it? No matter which way you slice it, that scene was just dumb. And that leads us to one major issue I had with the film, and the one thing that is a serious downgrade from the first film, and that's the villain. So, this film has a twist villain, and I called it. The second the character first appeared, I correctly guessed that she was the villain. I knew that the brother was a red herring and that she was the mastermind behind the whole thing. Personally, I think a better twist would have been that they were both in on the creation of the supervillain fighting Elastigirl, but the brother had noble intentions of wanting to bring back supers, whereas his sister had malevolent intentions. Also, the sister's plan doesn't make any sense. So, keep in mind, superheroes are already illegal, but she wants to make superheroes even more illegal, I guess. She wants them illegal forever, which is, by the way, not a thing. There is no such thing as to make something permanently illegal, but whatever. She wants to keep superheroes illegal, so her plan is to build up the PR of supers, build up support from the general public, making them legal again, and then hypnotizing supers into being evil, which would drive down public support again, which would make supers illegal again. That seems pretty overly complicated, and I feel like there was a much more straightforward way of accomplishing her goals. Also, her motivations doesn't really make much sense. She blames supers for the death of her parents, not the burglars who broke in, not her father for having zero self-preservation skills, but the supers who had nothing to do with the incident whatsoever. The supers that didn't come because they were illegal, which, by the way, is something that she supports. So, yeah, that element of the film really sucks, and it does knock down the film an entire peg for me. And sure, I could be cynical and think, yeah, Brad Bird had 14 years to iron out the wrinkles and he botched something up this badly. But honestly, the rest of the film is just so strong and so entertaining that I am willing to give it a pass. I'm going to give Incredibles 2 a 9 out of 10. This movie gave me pretty much exactly what I wanted out of a sequel to The Incredibles. I enjoyed spending time with these characters. I enjoyed watching them bounce off of each other. I thought that the action was spectacular, and it's just really funny. If the villain had been better written, this could have easily been a 10 out of 10 for me, and I'd be debating over which film I liked more. But anyway, I had a blast with this film, and I was so happy to revisit it. Toy Story 4. Yeah, like so many others before me, when I heard this film first announced, my reaction was, well, a groan. Like, really? Pixar, really? The third film ended the franchise perfectly. Then 9 years later, you decide to make yet another sequel. And then I thought, well, yeah, I mean, this is Pixar though, but surely they wouldn't revitalize this franchise unless they had a really, really good story to tell. And for the most part, I'd say it does tell a good story, but I also have to say this is pretty clearly the weakest Toy Story film by a pretty significant margin. And it feels by far the least polished, which is insane when you consider how quickly Toy Story 2 was made and how long production on this film lasted. Now, granted, the bar for these films was so high that anything other than perfection would have felt like disappointment. That being said, this is still a pretty good movie. The one thing the Toy Story films have been great at is introducing some great new characters, and yeah, this film's no exception. Forky is a great character. The existential crisis that this character goes through from being literal trash, being turned against his will into a living, breathing toy is both hilarious and actually kind of frightening. And the running gag of him continuously trying to throw himself into the trash is absolutely gut-busting, especially if you read into it that it's basically him trying to commit suicide over and over again. And Randy Newman's song of I Can't Let You Throw Yourself Away, set to a montage of Forky trying to essentially kill himself repeatedly, makes the already morbid joke even funnier. Another really funny character that gets introduced in this film is Duke Kaboom, voiced by Keanu Reeves, and he is just hilarious. His mannerisms and expressions and his method of speaking is just comedy gold, and his backstory is both tragic and funny at the same time. While we're on the subject, I was actually kind of surprised, pleasantly so, at how cruel this film could get at times. This film doesn't sugarcoat how not every kid is like Andy when it comes to toys. Some of them can be kind of cruel or flighty, whether it be, Bonnie losing interest in Woody or Harmony rejecting Gabby. And it is kind of cool to see this kind of society of toys who revel in being lost toys, who love to explore and see the world to the point that I actually kind of wanted to see more of them. And it is interesting to see how Bo Peep has changed after spending so many years without an owner. And the contrast between her and Woody showing how they've changed is definitely compelling. This is also the most visually exciting Toy Story film to date. Not only did this film nail down humans really well, but there's also a cat in the antique store that actually looks pretty realistic at times. And the opening scene of Woody trying to save RC is beautifully animated and truly a sight to behold. However, the one scene that I think elevates this film from being pretty good to great comes near the end of the film, and I actually think that this is the true emotional climax of the film, not the actual ending. It's the scene where, as the gang is trying to get back to the van, Gabby notices a little girl, lost, alone, and crying. And Gabby decides that even after she had just been rejected by Harmony, the one girl that she thought that she was destined to be with, she decides to put herself back out there in the hopes that not only might she get an owner that she's desired for so long, but more importantly, she can comfort someone who needed her help. And sure enough, the lost girl sees her, and after hearing the doll's voice and deciding to take care of the doll, she calms down and gains the confidence to reach out to an officer so that she can be reunited with her parents. It is such an incredibly powerful scene, is easily the best scene in the entire film, and it's one of the best scenes in the entire Toy Story franchise. But still, this film does contain some of the first legitimate problems in a Toy Story film. One big issue that plagues this entire film that really bugged me is that, aside from Woody, Bo Peep, and Buzz, none of the returning toys really feel like they're a part of the story or even contribute all that much. They pretty much only do a little bit of contributing in the climax. That's it, and even then, all they really do is stall Bonnie's family so that they don't leave. They just don't feel particularly well utilized. And when a film has a cast of characters this big, it wouldn't bother me so much, except that the other films actually did utilize them, and they did it well, so yeah, I know it can be done. And I know that some of this isn't the crew's fault. Like, in between 3 and 4, Don Rickles passed away, and I guess they didn't want to replace him like they did with Jim Varney after his passing, so they had no choice but to use archival footage. And it is very noticeable and distracting. His dialogue is so nondescript, generic, and bland due to being limited to just a handful of lines, which, yeah, that's definitely disappointing considering that nobody did insults and roasting like Don Rickles, and that shined through in his performance as Mr. Potato Head. But he feels so neutered here, and as do most of the returning characters. Heck, considering that even Slinky doesn't get that many lines of dialogue, they might as well have used archival footage of Jim Varney's recordings. The pacing is also a little bit wonky at times. For example, Forky's issue of trying to throw himself away kinda just gets resolved a little bit too quickly and too early in the story. Buzz's subplot about him listening to his inner voice is kind of amusing, but I don't know, that just felt kind of forced to me. If this was like Toy Story 2 Buzz, I would buy it, but not Toy Story 4 Buzz. And while it isn't that big of an issue, I do need to mention that the ending to this film isn't as strong as Toy Story 3's ending. Now, it's still good, but I don't know, for a film that ends with a duo that has been completely inseparable, parting ways for good, the emotions just weren't as strong as I wanted it to be. Maybe because the decision felt a little bit rushed and it wasn't quite built up properly like I wanted it to be, but like I said, it works fine in the story and it's a nice ending, but when your previous film's ending is such a high note of an ending, and even though I do like this film, a part of me just kind of wishes this film didn't exist because of just how the last film ended. But in the end, what really matters is whether or not this is a good film, and it is a good film. It's got some really funny scenes, and there's some new characters that are entertaining, and like I said, that one scene near the end really elevates this film. I'm going to give Toy Story 4 an 8 out of 10. Granted, I did kind of go back and forth between an 8 and a 9 because most of the film is pretty good, and like I said, that one scene is just so great, but yeah, this film definitely has some issues, and in all honesty, I wanted it to be better, especially when you consider Toy Story 3's ending. If you're going to add on yet another film to a series that ended perfectly, you need to make a darn compelling case that this movie needed to exist. But then again, I guess I should be grateful that 4 ended up as good as it did. But okay, seriously Pixar, we do not need a 5th one. The series has run its course, and it's time to put this franchise to rest. Yeah, I say that like anyone at Pixar is actually going to hear this. Onward. Now, I'm going to do something that I haven't done yet in any of these videos. I'm going to rate the movie first, then do the review. I'm going to give Onward an 8 out of 10. Now, why am I doing it this way? To put it bluntly, my opinions about this film are kinda all over the place. And some of you might think the rating on this film is too high. But if there is one Pixar film that I would classify it as a guilty pleasure, this would be it. And I want you to keep that and my rating in mind as I try to explain myself here. I understand that this film is unpolished and it has real issues that need to be addressed, but it also contains some really incredibly powerful moments. It also contains some of the laziest world building I've ever seen in my life in it, but then again, that laziness is also kind of the point, and okay, I'm getting sidetracked already. Let me start at the beginning, because honestly, and I'm not kidding when I say this is a film that gets better the more it continues. Like I said, the world building here is lazy. It's typical suburbia with a fantasy coat of paint on top of it. Which, to an extent, kinda makes sense when you realize that this is a world of fantasy creatures that stopped using magic, but I don't know, even taking that into account, given just how vast and varied the different creatures that exist in this world are, I have a hard time believing that their society and civilization would evolve to be pretty much identical to ours. I'm also not sure that I buy that magic would become so scarce that it's an incredibly tiny niche. They seem to be hinting that Barley is the only one or one of the very few in the entire city that's even the least bit interested in magic and their legacy and heritage and all that, and no, sorry, I don't buy it. And at first, I did find the characters a little bit stereotypical, and what they were going through was kinda, yeah, been there, done that. Kids are upset that one of their parents is dead, seen it already. Dragon that's a dog, seen it already. Kids disrespecting their stepfather, yeah, seen it already. Kid is awkward at school and embarrassed by a family member, yeah, we've seen all this already. And yeah, at first I thought I wasn't gonna like this film. However, once the magic spell brings back only the father's legs, suddenly this film clicks. Not completely, but there's definitely a creative spark. This is already kind of a funny and tragic idea of how their dead father is returned, but only the legs, and yet they're also able to convey personality through them actually pretty well. Then after that, it becomes a quest film, similar to the kind that you would see in a fantasy world, but it's in a world very similar to ours, which I actually thought was kind of neat. It kind of reminded me of a treasure hunt kind of film, yeah, not too dissimilar to National Treasure, and that part definitely intrigued me. There's even a fight scene involving pixie bikers, and while I do question the logistics of how and why the pixies would have motorcycles that big, the scene itself is actually incredibly entertaining. But yeah, the film's second act is mostly filled with entertaining set pieces in which the brothers face an obstacle, and the older one has to mentor the younger one into using magic, and that dynamic really works. I've always kind of liked this idea of a treasure hunt or quest like in an old fantasy world, but having it take place in our modern world. I don't know, it's just a plot or cliche or whatever you want to call it that I just enjoy. And this film is just one of those cases where the vibe it was going for really hit me and it made me go along with it. All of this builds to one incredibly powerful ending, which I will go into more in a little bit, but I want to tackle a few of the issues I had with the second act. As the brothers' quest is unfolding, there is a side plot about the Manticore and the boy's mother trying to track them down and warn them about the curse, and tracking down the Manticore's old sword, and sometimes those scenes can feel like padding. There's one scene in particular where they go to a pawn shop to get a sword, and the store owner price gouges it after realizing it's more valuable than she thought, but then they just stun the owner and take it from her. That scene doesn't really work at building tension because it's resolved too quickly. It doesn't really do any world building. It's not interesting. It's not really that funny. It doesn't build character development for any of the three characters in the scene, and the shop owner doesn't even come back later in the story. So, the scene feels completely pointless. The story would be completely the same if the Manticore still just had the sword back at her apartment or something and they just picked it up there. And I like these two characters, and I do kind of want to see more of them. Maybe if they'd written the finding of the sword as if it's more Journey-esque to, match and parallel the boy's quest, I think maybe that could have worked. Instead, this just feels like a minor detour. But anyway, I thought most of the second act was pretty good and consistently kept my interest. And what I like a lot about this film is the little touches that you don't really think about, but when you see it in a film can make you realize how some tropes are overplayed. For instance, in any other film, Barley would have been bitter or jealous that his younger brother would be able to do magic and he can't, but no, here they make it so that Barley is genuinely excited and happy for his younger brother. I actually thought that was a really nice touch. I also really like some of the limitations of the spells and magic, like how in order to pretend to be someone else, you have to keep telling the truth, and the more you lie, the more you get revealed to be your true self. That works as both a clever limitation on the magic system and also has a great subtextual meaning behind it as well. But what really sells this film for me and propels it into being a really good film is its ending. Now, for me, personally, the ending is probably the most important part of a film, because that's the part that tends to stick with the audience the most. It's what everything in the story is building towards. And not only do they stick the landing, they soar here. This is one of those endings where the film comes to a really heartfelt conclusion that I legitimately didn't see coming, and it was a really nice and great moment. And then on top of that, the sacrifices that a certain character makes feels completely earned and not out of place. And unlike other films where, yeah, they renege on the sacrifice, here, it sticks, and it sticks completely. It makes the moment all the more powerful and impactful because of it. And on top of having a great emotional climax, it also has a great climax. The big threat and curse that ends up being revealed ends up as a really hilarious punchline that the entire film was building to, but then it also ends up being a really intense scene with magic being utilized in a battle, and it's just fun to watch. So yeah, the film starts off a little weak, gets better for the most part as it progresses, and then finally it ends on a really great and powerful note. And rewatching this film again, knowing what the film was building to, actually made me appreciate a lot more what came before it. It was a film that, for me, was hovering around maybe a 6 or low 7 for most of the film, but then the ending just propelled it to an 8 for me. And there are not very many films that have that capability for me. Now, like I said, I do still have some issues with the film, mostly surrounding the world building and that unnecessary scene of the pawn shop and stuff like that. But the overall experience of this film left me feeling satisfied and was an instance of a film that I felt was even better upon rewatch. And yeah, I do get wanting this film to be a bit more imaginative with its setting, but for what it's trying to accomplish, I felt the filmmakers hit the mark just right. Soul. Now, a quick heads up before we get started, I'm going to be discussing this film's spoilers in great detail and at length, so if you haven't seen this film yet, I would highly recommend you do so before listening to this review. All I gotta say is see it, because it is an absolutely fantastic experience. If you were to ask me, I would say that this is Pixar's first animated film for adults. And while yes, I do think most kids would be able to get through this film fine, this is the first film where the adults are the priority when it comes to the story, themes, and writing. This film explores some really complex ideas related to the metaphysical, the purpose of living, the ennui that comes with achieving your dream, and a soul who just refuses to live. These are definitely not issues or plots that kids would be at all interested in, or would even be a blip on their radar, but they are issues that adults will definitely understand and identify with. While, yes, there are elements about the afterlife that are, silly that kids would probably enjoy, it's the way these themes are presented and the genius way it all ties in together that makes it feel so categorically adult. This film has so many different interpretations of the events that unfold that this film is consistently engaging. The way the film utilizes jazz as a motif is just wonderful as well. If my understanding of jazz is correct, jazz is all about improvisation, not really getting too hung up on the specific notes, but just letting loose and letting the music move you. You could definitely make the argument that Joe's love of jazz is a metaphor for how he should have been living his life from the start, and it may be why that message sticks with him. Life is kind of like jazz, and that there is kind of this improvisational feel to it, and how there really is no sheet music that tells us exactly what we should do, but we're just kind of living it and letting it move us as we experience it. The one scene that I think exemplifies the film's themes the most is the scene where Joe and 22 go see Des the barber. We find out that he didn't really want to be a barber at first. He actually wanted to be a vet. But circumstances in his life forced him to be a barber instead. Sure, it's not exactly what he wanted, but he's certainly not unhappy with his surroundings. In fact, he finds himself very fulfilled in what he does. It's a nice scene that illustrates the theme of life's plans not always working out like we want, but we can still find joy and fulfillment in it. Another aspect of this film's genius is that it leaves several elements ambiguous, and it knew which elements to keep ambiguous. For instance, I'm glad that we don't see what's in the great beyond. I'm glad that we don't see 22's life on Earth, and I'm glad that we don't see what choices and changes Joe made to his life upon returning to Earth. The last one in particular is so important because you can reflect the message that you took away from the film back onto Joe. Your own interpretation of the film can help color in what you think Joe decided to do with his life after coming back from the dead. And even more importantly, the film shows that ultimately it doesn't matter. What truly matters is that he's alive and he's going to appreciate every single day he lives, no matter what comes his way. So yeah, this film deals with some pretty heavy themes, and it does so with skill and finesse and in a way that's digestible. But even if you look at a film on a surface level, this is still a great experience. I mean, if you've ever seen this film, you know just how breathtaking the animation is. I mean, the backgrounds in the real world are just stunning at how realistic they look. And unlike the Good Dinosaur where the CG characters pop out and not in a good way, here the CG characters both blend into their surroundings, but they also manage to stand out at the same time. And that's just in the real world. In the spirit realm, the animation is also great, but in a different way. Rather than trying to be realistic like New York, here the backgrounds are ethereal and yet also solid. And the designs for the souls and the Jerrys are also great. The Jerry's designs especially are marvelous because they blend both two-dimensional and three-dimensional art at the same time. I can't really explain it or describe it, which again ties into how their true forms are difficult for humans to comprehend, and it also just looks fantastic, like a piece of cubic art that's come to life. And thankfully, all these characters are just extremely well written and have great chemistry with each other. It is a stroke of genius that we follow two characters with completely contradictory goals and watching them bounce off of each other. Joe wants to return to life because he is so sure that his purpose is finally being realized and he isn't ready to go yet. Whereas 22 doesn't want to live at all because she sees absolutely nothing appealing about life that would make it worth living. And depending on what type of person you are, or even possibly what stage in your life you're currently at, you'll find yourself drawn more to one of these character struggles. Me personally, I find myself connecting slightly more to 22's struggles of trying to find out what her spark even is. But everyone's motivations in this film are completely and 100% understandable, and it's communicated perfectly. Whether it be Joe's mother trying to be supportive of her son's dreams while also making it clear that she worries about his well-being and job security, to even Terry's desire to make sure that nobody cheats the afterlife system. By the way, Terry is just such a funny character. I love how the afterlife has this kind of accountant who keeps track of how many souls have passed on and how seriously they take it when someone tries to escape their fate and how far they're willing to go to track him down. The scene where she accidentally mistakes Paul for Joe and then tries to brush off her basically killing him as kind of just this little whoopsie is both cruel and hilarious. And the comedy for this film also really shines. Whether it be the kind of dark humor related to death and the afterlife, or even the slapstick related to a character trying to operate a human body for the first time, the humor for this film is always on point and it's never out of place whenever it pops up. So yeah, this film sounds great, and it definitely is. In fact, I would describe this film as almost perfect, which is impressive. But there are a couple of elements to this film that, while I definitely wouldn't say they're flaws, they do give me some pause and they need to be discussed. Probably the biggest question is whether or not Joe should have died at the end. And I mean, yeah, I did want him to return to Earth, and now that he's finally gotten a new outlook on life, he can now live his life with that mindset and live a much happier life. But on the other hand, I can't help but feel like it is a little bit of a cop-out, especially considering that there is power in the message of, yeah, sometimes people will die young, and yeah, it's not fair, but no matter how much time you have on Earth, it is still worth living, and you can live a great and fulfilling existence, and there is worth in a life that ended too soon. But then again, there is kind of this feel that the Jerrys are basically allowing this to happen on purpose, which does kind of lessen the whole Deus Ex Machina nature of the ending, at least to me. Just personally, I can definitely see the benefits of either or, but if I was writing it, I probably would have ended it with him just looking back at how great his life was and accepting his fate, as we all must do one way or another eventually. But yeah, I'm not going to dock a point from a film for having an ending that, while still great, is slightly less great than the ending I would have preferred. The only real nitpick I have with this film is that it never really explains how Mr. Mitten's soul managed to get back to his body. Yeah, I get it, cats have 9 lives, but I would have liked to have seen just exactly how his soul got back, because on my first viewing I found that kind of distracting. But aside from that, this is a nearly perfect film. This is a masterpiece and one of Pixar's very best films, and just one of my favorite films in general. This is yet another one of those rare films that I can watch anytime. It's a film that I will always be in the mood for. I'm going to give Soul a 10 out of 10. It's not often I can say that a film helped me shape my views on living or give me inspiration every single time I see it, but this is one of those rare films. I cannot stress this enough. If you have not seen it, just see it. It's wonderful. Luca. This is the first Pixar film that I actually had not seen prior to the making of this video. I was just preoccupied with other projects and my job and the like, so I neglected to catch it when it was first released on Disney Plus last year. But now, I actually have the perfect opportunity to watch it. So, what did I think after putting it off for so long? It's good. Not great, but good. This is a film where I'd say everything that's done right is done really right, but the things that are not done right are really not done right. Thankfully, this film has more good elements than bad elements, but man, do I wish the bad elements weren't here. I do see this film as a possible stepping stone for Pixar going forward and the kind of films that they could make, and I'd like to see them make, but if they're going to, they really need to let some of their old tropes and conventions die if they do. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the easiest way for me to describe this film is that it has the vibe and tone of a Studio Ghibli type film. You know, low-key, mostly just characters living their life and hanging out with each other and bouncing off of each other, but it has the plot of every bland, generic American animated kids film. For instance, the film opens up with the main character's parents warning him about how dangerous something is, but he doesn't listen, so they decide since he won't listen, they feel they need to be mean to him to set him straight. Yeah, it's the same thing with Coco. The parents don't listen cliche, and it is presented just as boringly as you would think. As a quick aside, I also have to say that I thought their subplot of throwing water on random kids to check for Luca was stupid. Not because I don't find it amusing, because I did, but it just feels woefully out of character for them. The whole reason they're looking for him was because they're worried the townsfolk will kill him if it's revealed that he's a sea monster. So they're going to find him by revealing his true sea monster form right there out in the open where anyone in town can see it. Brilliant. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, the generic plot and tropes. So anyway, then the main characters decide to run away and buy a scooter, but they can't because they don't have money. So they need to win a race to win the prize money, but since they don't know about the human customs, they need to train, and thus they have to become part of a team, and there's this mean bully who's just there to be a mean bully, and that's it. And then you have the obligatory scene where the two friends go through a rough patch in their relationship, and it culminates in a huge fight where they snap at each other and go their separate ways. Okay, filmmakers, this trope has been firmly beaten into the ground by this point. Can you please think of some more original ways to stir up drama? And like I said, a lot of this wouldn't bother me as much if the tone matched the plot, but it really doesn't. Honestly, the best scenes were the ones where the characters are just hanging with each other or talking. Alberto and Luca's attempts at using the ramp, Luca and Julia bonding over astronomy, Luca and Alberto out on the sea with Massimo helping him fish. But when you constantly get sucked out of those great moments and you suddenly get jerked back into the racing story that honestly is not really that interesting or high stakes. It's just a generic underdog sports film. It's the Happy Gilmore plot, only not nearly as funny or self-aware with its plot. Honestly, it feels like you're watching two completely separate movies, and I'm not sure who's to blame for that. Maybe the director Enrico Casarosa wanted a more slice-of-life story with just a touch of magical realism, and Pixar forced those changes to make it more mainstream, or maybe this was his intention all along and Pixar didn't force those changes. I don't know, but for whatever reason, this is the one time that I actually wanted less plot in a film. I enjoyed these characters from Alberto and Luca and Julia and Massimo that I could watch a film with just the four of them talking, and honestly, I would be completely satisfied. And I get it. It's a weird complaint / compliment to have, but I really do think that the added forced tension with the race was unnecessary. And the main reason for that is because there's already a fair amount of built-in tension in the story. It's a coastal town that hates sea monsters, and the two boys are revealed to be sea monsters whenever they get wet. The tension practically writes itself. I'm not even sure what Ercole's role in the story is. Yeah, he's a bully that works against the trio, but what actual narrative purpose does he serve? What does he actually do? He basically tries to kill Alberto and Luca once it's revealed they're sea monsters. That's about it. His role could have been performed by basically any other random denizen, which I could forgive if he was funny or memorable, but he's really not. Now, he's not awful, and he's not even really that bad. He's just kind of mediocre. He's basically a whinier, more pathetic version of Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, minus the hunter motif. And, like I said, he matches the tone of the more mainstream racing plot, but because he's so cartoonishly silly, he feels out of place in comparison with the more grounded slice-of-life elements. Now, I know this sounds like I'm crapping all over the film, but truth be told, I do like this movie. There's a lot of things to admire about it. The characters are all great, the bonds and relationships that form feel so natural, and you can buy them all very easily. There's a great scene where after Alberto doesn't return home, Massimo goes out to look for him without a hint of hesitation. The animation is surprisingly really nice. I say surprisingly because I have to admit at first I wasn't really a fan of the character designs. They seemed a little bit too cutesy for my taste, but I have to admit, I was surprised at how quickly it won me over once the film began and how not distracting it became as the story continued. And even aside from the designs, the look of the film is really good too, whether it be the underwater world, which, believe it or not, feels surprisingly claustrophobic, which helps you empathize with Luca's plight about feeling trapped down below, or just the feel of the town. The entire film captures the look and feel of the summer season incredibly well, especially through its use of a soft, warm color palette. And while, yeah, I wasn't a fan of the Luca's parents dunking kids in the water joke, it did actually lead to a really funny punchline where they're put in charge of handing out water to exhausted kids riding a bike, and none of the kids want anything to do with the water. It's actually a surprisingly cruel joke that got a laugh out of me. There's also some nice touches here and there, like how we don't see Alberto's freak out in the treehouse, just the aftermath. That was actually a really smart move that lets us fill in the gaps in a much more powerful way than if it was shown to us. These are all great moments, which is why I wish they were in a great film. Really, the biggest issue of the film is the story and just how predictable and by the numbers it is. There's just not that much new that's being added here. If the film was just about the misadventures of two boy sea monsters in a town that hate sea monsters, and there wasn't really any overarching plot, just drop the racing subplot altogether and either rewrite or get rid of Hercule, I would have enjoyed this a lot more. I just wanted this to be a slice-of-life adventure about growing up and the bond that forms between these kids. The addition of the race feels like something that was added in order to make the film feel more westernized, and it just doesn't fit the tone and vibe of this film. This legitimately feels like a great film and a mediocre film duking it out because it feels so disconnected. But, like I said, none of those things ruin the film at all. I just think it prevents it from being great. And I hope that maybe a future Pixar film will take the elements from this film that work and eliminate all the stuff that doesn't, and I think we can get something truly special. I'm going to give Luca a 7 out of 10. Also, I have to ask, was the use of the name Bruno as the inner voice that you're not supposed to listen to something that Pixar and Disney coordinated with, or was that just a coincidence? Because that really threw me off. Turning Red. Oh, now, here's a film that is surely not being discussed enough right now, and I'm sure is being discussed with the utmost civility and respect. And even though this film is still very new as of the recording of this video, I think it's safe to assume that Brave has finally been dethroned as Pixar's most divisive film ever. Some praising it as a beautiful coming-of-age story, and others deriding it as an unfocused mess. On top of that, I really didn't care much for the trailer and the character designs, and the word of mouth that I'd heard from people that I know personally was not positive. Needless to say, I wasn't looking forward to watching this. But made it this far, might as well check it out and give my 2 cents on it. Anyway, now that I've finally seen it, after all this build-up, you're probably asking, what did I think of it? I didn't hate it, but I didn't really care that much for it either. It's not the worst thing ever, but I am not exaggerating when I say this film is a real mixed bag. So of course, since a lot of people really like this film, some of you may be asking, well, what on earth is wrong with it? Well, let's start with the main character, and you'll see what I mean when I say this film is a mixed bag. On one hand, May does in many respects come across as a realistic young teenage girl, both the good and the bad. She's got kind of this I do what I want attitude and vibe that, I'm not gonna lie, I actually find really irritating in characters. There's a way to do it right, but when it's not done right, these characters are aggravating to watch. And this film, that balance is sometimes met, but other times it's not, and I found her irritating to watch as a result. Another area where this film is kind of a mixed bag is in its themes and its messages. Now, on the surface, a lot of these messages are not bad, and a lot of them actually do tie in together pretty well. For instance, the film is about that awkward stage in between childhood and adulthood, trying to find yourself, trying to figure out what it is you want to do to become more independent and not to be forced to fit the mold that your parents want you to be. On the surface, this is not a bad moral, and actually it's been done multiple times in many other films, even other kids' films. And it even ties into the subtler themes of the culture clash of the East versus the West when it comes to immigration, like how the parents want their child to be more in line with the culture they came from, while the child is more in tune with the culture that they grew up in. But if I'm being honest, the execution here just feels off, and part of it is because I don't think they thought through their implications 100%, which is not helped by the fact that the story works against the metaphor. So, this film tries to paint the mother as an overprotective helicopter parent, and yeah, for the most part she is, but then it fundamentally screws up the aspect that is the crux of the entire second act, her not letting May go to a concert. This one act, more than anything, sets the plot's conflict into motion, and the film tries to paint this as this kind of overbearing, overprotective kind of thing, but actually I kind of agree with the mother on this one issue. This isn't just a case of, the mother not wanting her to go because concerts and music are evil or anything like that. No, the mother actually has a legit reason for not wanting May to go, namely that May is going through this transformation, something that is very, very new to her, and really she should not be putting herself in a situation like that so soon, especially if the way to keep the panda hidden is to not feel any strong emotions. Sure, they try to hide it by sprinkling in some strawman arguments about how the band is evil, but that doesn't disguise the fact that her core concern is valid. Whether it be trying to keep it a secret or not cause a riot or something at the concert or, accidentally stepping on someone in a very crowded area or, worrying that May might snap, like she did at Tyler's birthday. I don't see her telling her daughter that she can't go to the concert for either her safety or the safety of the other concert goers as being unreasonable. And that's a really big problem in terms of the story. So when May decides to disobey her mother and raise money to go to the concert, it doesn't feel earned or warranted or even justified. And if the message of the film was supposed to be that while the mother was wrong for not wanting May to go, or more accurately, that because she was so overprotective before, that May couldn't differentiate between when she was being unreasonable and when she was being reasonable, and that May was also in the wrong for sneaking behind her mother's back, I think a lot of this would be more justified. But instead, the film seems to fully take May's side on the issue, and the climax basically consists of the mother accepting that she was wrong and May was right, when really, I don't think May was right in this instance. I was also trying to figure out what exactly May's red panda form is supposed to represent. At first I thought maybe it was supposed to be a metaphor for something like menstruation or puberty, especially since it's a red panda that appears when she's excited. It's genetic, it only affects the women of the family, and it pops up when she's 13, but no, the whole conflict of the film stems from the fact that her family essentially wants her to entrap it in some kind of charm so that it can't ever get out. And then the adult women briefly revert back into that form in the climax to help May, and then quickly entrap it again. So that doesn't work as a metaphor because that's not how puberty or periods work. Is it supposed to represent just being a woman or womanhood? Because if so, that's actually an even worse interpretation, because it's implying that the other women in the family who choose to give up their panda forms are not real women. but since it's tied to her emotions, I guess it's supposed to represent women who have strong emotions and how it's socially unacceptable, except it isn't, since everyone except May's family thinks the red panda thing is just the coolest thing ever, but whatever. Yeah, that's right. Just like Captain Marvel or Mulan, the message is you shouldn't let other people tell you to control or hide your emotions. And yeah, are we really doing this message again? It wasn't good when those movies did it. I don't know why you think you're going to get a pass here. I don't know. Maybe I'm misreading this, but that's how it came across to me. So, yeah, to an extent, this is a film about a young girl going through a rough time and trying to get a grip on her emotions. Yeah, you know, kind of like Inside Out. But whereas that film was able to convey really complex emotions and ideas in a straightforward and clever method, this film opts to go for a very standard, generic, and even kind of confused route. There's also some pretty sloppy storytelling mistakes in here. Like, the film makes a big deal about how May only has one chance to trap the red panda in a charm, and that's why it has to be done on this one night and she has to miss the concert, and how they paint this as an irreversible decision. But then in the climax, that's exactly what happens to the other women in the family. They revert back to their original panda form and then just change back to normal. But wait, I thought they only had one chance to trap the panda. Unless the entire point was that they were all lying to May to get her to fall in line, or if they just don't understand all the logistics of how this works, or something. I don't know. If that was the point, neither of those were conveyed well at all. Anyway, most of the other characters in this film are fine. Most of them are non-entities. I can't really say that May's friends, with the exception of Miriam, really stood out. May's dad is fine. He doesn't do that much, but he's passable. May's extended family are fine. Again, none of them really stand out, but none of them are awful characters or anything like that. And like I said, I just wasn't a fan of the character design or art style all that much. I thought maybe like Luca, it would win me over as the film progressed, but it really didn't. It still looks way better than Earwig and the Witch's attempt at integrating CG with anime, but I still don't think it quite works. Something about it just feels off. I should also note that I didn't find any of the jokes in this movie, like, funny. At all. I don't think I laughed once. There's a couple of halfway amusing jokes, like how the dad says that his wife's panda form really was that big, or when the mom tries to pretend that she's not at home when her own mother calls them on the phone, which actually ties in pretty well to the film's message about generational trauma, or that May somehow managed to put together a intricate PowerPoint slideshow very quickly to argue with her parents about why she should go to the concert. I actually thought that was cute, and it actually exudes a lot of character without being too in your face. But a lot of jokes are either inferior versions of jokes we've already seen, or they rely a lot on cringe comedy, which might be my least favorite subgenre of comedy ever. You know, the comedy that derives from situations that are just so awkward and embarrassing that it makes you want to crawl under a rock. It is so rarely done correctly because I don't find those kind of things funny. I just find it, well, embarrassing and awkward. Yeah, I remember being a young, stupid kid, and I remember doing young and stupid things as a kid, or having stupid things done by my parents in front of other people, and I would very much like to not think about those things and the feeling I felt in those young and stupid moments in the media that I consume. It takes me out of the story. Yeah, this is actually why, despite a lot of people praising it, I just couldn't get into 8th grade. I just don't find that kind of stuff entertaining, insightful, or funny. It's like saying, yeah, growing up is awkward. Everyone who's an adult knows that. I don't need to be reminded of it. It's the same problem here, like with the scene where the mother accuses an employee of a convenience store of being a groomer, or the scene where the mother tries to give May her pads at school. These scenes are painful to watch, and they're supposed to be painful to watch, but I don't enjoy them, and I certainly don't find them funny. And when those kind of scenes pop up, I just kind of zone out and wait for the moment to pass. Now, one thing I do think needs to be brought up is that some people are saying this is probably Pixar's first film where I could actually see a lot of parents not wanting their younger kids to see it due to some content concerns, particularly when it comes to the mildly suggestive material, such as referencing stripper music, some twerking, references to gyrating, the aforementioned scene where the mother accuses a teenager of grooming her daughter. You get the picture. Now, I wouldn't call the film racy by any stretch of the imagination, certainly not in comparison to other coming-of-age films that I've seen that can actually get pretty raunchy. But I think the reason there was kind of this pushback with this film is that, well, it is Pixar and it's Disney, and while, yes, they're definitely not afraid to shy away from some more mature material, they are still primarily aiming their films, at least tangentially, at a younger audience, and this film, clearly it's not. It's distinctly aimed at an older kid crowd. As such, this is a Pixar film that I would say is categorically and safely in PG territory. Probably more so than even Up, and to an extent, the Incredibles films. Now, I have heard some complaints about Pixar tackling issues that might be too mature for some of the young ones who might watch it. However, I don't really see that as a negative. I'm all for a company trying to branch out, try a bit more mature or edgy material if they feel they can pull it off. And if a parent really is that concerned about the content of a film, there's resources for them to check, and all they have to do is tell their kid, no, maybe when you're older. Ultimately, it's the parents' responsibility for regulating what their young kids watch and don't watch. But yeah, I also do kind of get the complaints about parents not knowing that the film was too mature for their kids, but at the same time, I wouldn't wag the finger at Pixar at that. I'd more blame the fact that the PG rating has been watered down so much that parents now automatically assume that anything rated PG is a family film, when that's not what that rating means. And okay, I need to step aside for a minute and rant about the MPAA rating system and how fundamentally broken it is and why it contributed, at least in part, to the backlash this film got. Guys, this is what happens when you spend over a decade rating films that perfectly fine and appropriate for kids and giving them PG ratings. Tangled, Frozen, Finding Dory, films that absolutely under no circumstances should have been rated PG for any reason. Oh, Flynn Rider gets stabbed in the back with a knife, off screen, and then survives? Oh, PG. That foot-sized joke in Frozen that literally no kid on earth is going to get? PG. Oh, what's this? A film about a young child being separated from her parents and trying to find them again? Too intense for kids. PG. You see, when you dilute the PG rating as much as you've been doing, the average casual viewer cannot distinguish between films that most kids would sit through fine and films that are clearly aimed at an older kid audience. At that point, you're not actually helping to guide parents to make more informed decisions about what their kids are watching. You're doing the exact opposite. The original Lion King was rated G almost 30 years ago, so get your act together. Wow. I got off topic with that one. I'm sorry. What was I talking about? Oh yeah. So anyway, I don't see this edgier material as necessarily a positive or a negative, but for those looking for something for their kids to watch, I do think that's something that you need to be aware of. For me, though, how edgy a film is really depends on how it's utilized. And I don't think it's utilized poorly, but I don't think it's utilized greatly either. Also, there's an occasional cringe moment, not as much as I thought there would be, but they're still in here. Like, the opening 10 minutes I found pretty obnoxious and paced way too frantically. Oh, and the line, "My panda, my choice," is such a cringe-inducing line. But I should also be fair and say that this is not an awful film. While I wasn't a fan of the character designs, the actual animation itself is actually fine and good. The film definitely takes an anime inspiration, and while I'm kind of unsure about some aspects of the animation, you can see in the climax they actually utilize the feel and tone of an anime really well. And then you also have to admit, the texture and attention to detail of May's panda form, especially the tail, is outstanding. And the characters, like I said, they're not really bad, it's just that most of them don't really stand out. And on paper, some of these themes and ideas are seeds for something really, really great. I kind of like where they were going with this film's theme of generational trauma, like how you were raised can affect how you'll raise your own children, but in my opinion, it's just not focused on enough. And the last thing I will say about this film is that for better or worse, the film did take risks and it did take chances. This film probably feels the least like a Pixar film compared to any of the others that came before it. And I'm not going to fault the film for trying something new and different in a different style aimed at an older audience with a more cynical bent. So in that regard, in a strange way, I do have some respect for it, even if I don't think the final product actually works. In my opinion, the writing is just too sloppy and unfocused. I'm going to give Turning Red a 5 out of 10. I've seen better coming-of-age stories, but to be fair, I've also seen worse. If this film meant something to you, then that's perfectly fine, and I get it if it did. It just didn't do a thing for me one way or the other, which is rather ironic for a film that's all about strong emotions. Anyway, that's it. As of the recording of this video, that's every feature-length Pixar film released to date, reviewed. So, here's the stats. 21 good films, 3 mediocre films, and only 1 bad film. That is a very impressive catalog of films. What's most impressive is that from 1995 to 2010, not only did Pixar not make a bad film, but the overwhelming majority of them were accomplished and modern classics. Pixar understood both how to tell a good, compelling story, they knew how to craft memorable, relatable characters, and they were also trying to push the technology as far as they could go, not to show off, but so they could tell the best story they possibly could. But yeah, then Cars 2 happened, and then the studio kind of lost their groove. Now, they were still for the most part making good, solid films and would occasionally make a masterpiece, but they weren't quite the juggernaut they once were, which is understandable. I mean, when you start out so strong and then you finally make a fumble, it can be difficult to get back on track. But even then, with only a handful of exceptions, the films they made have at the very least been just fine. I'm honestly not even sure what else to say here. The only thing I can say is that with both Luca and especially Turning Red, it seems like Pixar is going to at least attempt to break away from their old style and their familiar plot beats and try something a little bit different. Now, something different doesn't always translate to a better product, but it will at the very least be interesting to look at, and I do wish them the best of luck going forward. Maybe they'll get back on the groove they were in early on, or maybe they won't, but regardless, we'll always have their classic films, and for now at least, we can say that a bad Pixar film is an exception rather than the rule, and that, I think, is rather commendable. And now, here are all the Pixar feature films to date ranked from worst to best, as for my personal opinion. Number 25, the worst Pixar film is Cars 2. Number 24 is Brave. Number 23 is Turning Red. Number 22 is The Good Dinosaur. Number 21 is Cars 3. Number 20 is Monsters University. Number 19 is Coco. Number 18 is Luca. Number 17 is Onward. Number 16 is Cars. Number 15 is Toy Story 4. Number 14 is A Bug's Life. Number 13 is Finding Dory. Number 12 is Monsters, Inc. Number 11 is Incredibles 2. Number 10 is Finding Nemo. Number 9 is Toy Story 2. Number 8 is The Incredibles. Number 7 is Toy Story 3. Number 6 is Toy Story. Number 5 is Up. Number 4 is Ratatouille. Number 3 is Soul. Number 2 is... Okay. I kept going back and forth between what my favorite Pixar film is, and functionally speaking, these two are very close to a tie. Now, there was only one film that I said was completely perfect, but the other film also contains my favorite Pixar moment of all time, and the nitpicks in the film are so incredibly minute that they're almost not worth mentioning. So, I guess my number 2 pick is WALL-E. And finally, number 1, my favorite Pixar film is Inside Out. But seriously, consider WALL-E and Inside Out basically tied for my number 1 spot, with my preference depending on what mood I'm in. They're both really that fantastic. And yeah, I guess that's it. If you're still with me, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like and subscribing if you haven't already. Hopefully the next long-form review video, whatever it is, won't take as long as this one did. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.